The wind in 1884 was a different kind of cold. It didn't just chill a person, it skinned them. It came down from the high passes of the Red Hollow, carrying the grit of the mountains and the sharp, clean scent of pine resin. And it sliced straight through denim and wool to the bone beneath. Goldie Harker didn't hunch against it. She drove the post. The heavy mallet felt good in her hands, solid and real. The thud as it struck the head of the lodgepole pine was a punctuation mark. This is mine. The Harker livery was barely half a skeleton, a series of uprights and crossbeams rising from the frozen mud at the edge of the wash. It was her penance and her declaration, built with timber she'd traded for by mending harnesses until her fingers bled. She'd come west to escape the whispers, the pitying looks, the quiet judgment of Boston drawing rooms. She'd come to bury the woman her fiancé had left behind, the woman whose name had been soiled by her father's spectacular financial collapse. That woman was dead. Goldie was the inheritor of the mess. Her father hadn't left her a dime, only a stack of promissory notes and a reputation for grand, failed dreams, the Harker burden, they'd called it, here in Red Hollow. She was just Goldie. A woman foolish enough to build a livery stable on a patch of land nobody wanted. With winter coming on fast, she spat on her raw palms, gripped the mallet, and swung again. She heard the horse before she saw it. The slow, steady hoof fall of an animal picking its way carefully along the slick rock of the Thunderhead Wash. She didn't stop her work, but her shoulders tensed. Strangers were rarely good news. He pulled up not 10 yards away. The man was as solitary as the horse he rode, a lean figure in a canvas slicker worn gray with weather. He didn't dismount, just sat the saddle, watching. He wasn't a gunman. His posture was wrong. He was a rancher, weary to his core. When he pushed his hat back, she saw his eyes. They were the color of pine wood that had been left to cure in the sun for a full-season gray-green, quiet and deeply settled. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel rolling in a dry creek bed. "Name's Silas Crowell. My place is the Blue Lantern. Up the wash. I'm running low on oats for my mare." Goldie stopped, resting the mallet on the half-driven post. She wiped a streak of mud from her cheek with the back of her glove, leaving a smear of pine tar in its place. Her gaze was flat and cold as river stone. "Livery's not open for trade." Silas nodded slowly. His eyes drifted from her face to the half-built structure, noting the clean joints, the way the posts were set true. He saw the blister on her thumb, red and angry. "See that? Just thought, no, it's fine. I'll ride on to town." He was turning his mare, a gesture of quiet retreat, but something in his tone, a weariness that matched her own, pricked her. It sounded too much like pity. "I don't take favors," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut leather. Silas stopped. He turned back, not angry, just observing. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the wall she'd built around herself. It was higher and stronger than the one she was building for the horses. "Wasn't offering a favor, ma'am," he said, his voice even. "I was offering payment. I don't take favors either." The silence stretched, filled only by the whine of the wind through the new beams. Goldie held his gaze, searching for the trick, the angle. She found none. There was just the man, his tired horse, and the need for oats. She needed coin. She needed the nails and shingles that coin would buy. "I have 2 bags," she said curtly. She stalked to the lean-to where her meager supplies were covered by a tarp. He dismounted, his movement stiff from the cold. He didn't follow her, respecting the invisible line she had drawn in the mud. She hauled the heavy burlap sack out, her muscles screaming in protest. He was there, taking it from her before she could object. His hands were large, scarred, the knuckles swollen. He handled the 50-pound bag as if it were feed for a chickadee. "The other one?" he asked. She pointed. He retrieved it, tying both behind his saddle. He reached into his coat. "What do I owe you?" She named a price that was a dime higher than the general stores. He didn't blink. He just counted out the coins, placing them directly into her gloved palm. "Much obliged," he said. He mounted his horse. "Your mare's thrown a shoe," Goldie said, looking at the animal's front left hoof. "She'll be lame before you hit the pass." Silas looked down. Figured as much. Was hoping she'd hold till town. "Bring her in." It wasn't a request. Goldie grabbed her farrier's box. For 10 minutes, they worked in silence. She, with a hoof between her knees, rasping and fitting a cold shoe she pulled from her stock. He, standing at the mare's head, murmuring softly to the animal, keeping it calm. When she was done, she dropped the hoof and stood, wiping her hands on her canvas trousers. Silas reached for his pocket again. "That one was a favor," Goldie said, cutting him off. "She's a good mare. Shouldn't suffer a bad ride on my account." Silas studied her again. The kindness in his eyes deepened, just for a moment, before he shielded it. "Then I'm in your debt, ma'am." "I don't keep a ledger," she replied, turning back to her post. She didn't watch him right away, but she felt his gaze on her back until the sound of his horse faded into the wind. The town of Red Hollow lived on rumors and railroad speculation. The latest whispers, picked up at the mercantile while she bought flour, concerned Ephraim Pike. Pike was the town's banker. He owned the hotel, held the note on the saloon, and, it was said, kept Sheriff Brackett on a short leash. Pike was buying land. Quietly. Anything that touched the Copper Kestrel Spur, a small, rocky ridge just north of her livery. The rumor was that the Union Pacific was looking to build a new loading yard, a place to weigh and ship cattle and timber coming down from the high country. Goldie tried to ignore it. Her fight wasn't with a banker. Her fight was with the weather, with gravity, and with the dwindling pile of coins in her biscuit tin. The letter arrived 3 days later. It was tucked into the jamb of the tack room door she'd just finished hanging. The envelope was thin, the paper cheap. Her name was written in an aggressive, looping script. In the corner was the seal of the Red Hollow Bank and Trust, but the ink was smeared, as if pressed by a thumb that was already dirty. She opened it with cold fingers. It was not a friendly inquiry. It was a formal notice of outstanding obligation. It spoke of a debt inherited from her father, a note she thought had been dissolved in the bankruptcy back east. But here it was, resurrected, attached to this specific parcel of land, the parcel her father had bought on his way west, the one he'd never seen, the one she'd claimed as her only inheritance, the bank. The letter stated, had acquired the note. The sum was staggering, bloated with interest charges that made no sense. She read the last line twice. The bank required payment in full. The deadline was 30 days. 30 days. Winter would be set in by then. The ground would be iron. She couldn't build. She couldn't sell. She couldn't leave. The paper trembled in her hand. This wasn't a bill. It was an eviction notice. Sheriff Brackett arrived that evening. He didn't ride up to her plot. He rode onto it, his horse trampling the line she'd strung for the new corral. He was a large man, soft in the middle, with a face that seemed perpetually slick with sweat, even in the freezing wind. "Evenin', Miss Harker," he called out, not dismounting. He had the lazy confidence of a man whose authority had never once been questioned. Goldie emerged from the tack room, a curry comb in her hand. She said nothing. "Just making my rounds," Brackett said, his eyes roving over the half-built stable. "Looking mighty ambitious. Awful lot of work for a woman alone. It's just work, Sheriff." He chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. He leaned forward on his saddle horn. "Listen, I'm a friend to the folks in this town, and I hear things. Heard you got some correspondence from Mr. Pike over at the bank." Goldie's grip tightened on the curry comb. "Tough spot," Brackett said, savoring the words. "Now, Ephraim Pike, he's a reasonable man. He's a businessman. He's looking to expand his interests. That spur line, it needs a loading yard. Needs storage. This plot you're on," he gestured with a gloved hand. It's just causing a bottleneck. It's my plot," Goldie said, her voice low. "Well, now, is a strong word, isn't it?" Brackett smiled, and as the wind shifted, she caught the smell of him. It was stale whiskey, chewing tobacco, and the sour odor of cheap, unearned power. See, Mr. Pike, he'd be willing to take this inconvenience off your hands. For a fair price, of course. Enough to get you a ticket back east. Maybe save you the trouble. What trouble? The smile faded. 30 days. Miss Harker, winter's comin'. Accidents happen. Fires. Structures fail in high winds. It's a dangerous world for someone unprotected. He put just enough weight on the last word to make it a threat. Is the bank paying you to deliver its mail, Sheriff, or just to light its fires? Brackett's face hardened. The friendly mask dropped, revealing the bully beneath. You're smart, Harker. Too smart for your own good. You're holding a losing hand. Pike gets what he wants. Sell the land, or the bank will take the land. Either way, you're gone. Think on it. Avoid the mess. He yanked his horse's head around, gouging the mud, and trotted off toward the lights of the saloon. Goldie stood there until the cold drove the rage from her head, leaving only a hard, cold knot in her stomach. She went back inside the tiny tack room, which smelled of fresh-cut wood, leather, and horse. It was the only home she had. She lit the lantern. The flickering light fell on the small, battered leather portfolio she kept under her cot, her father's papers, the testament of his failure. She pulled it out. She'd been through it 1,000 times, looking for anything of value, finding only expired contracts and bills of lading. But she pulled them out again, her hands shuffling through the brittle paper. She stopped at the one she always stopped at. A freight contract, signed by her father and an agent for a railroad that had gone bust 5 years ago. It was worthless, but she always read the last page. It was covered in fine print, clauses and sub-clauses, and at the very bottom, an addendum, handwritten and barely legible. A strange clause about demurrage fees and siding preference. Siding preference at Copper Kestrel's spur granted to Harker Freight if outstanding debts settled at cost by air. It had never made sense. A preference for a spur line that led nowhere. From a railroad that didn't exist, it was just more of her father's hot air, more ink on paper. She'd always dismissed it. Tonight, she didn't. She stared at the words, Copper Kestrel Spur. Pike wanted the land near the spur. A cold dread, sharper than the wind, settled over her. She looked out the small, square-cut window. The sky had finally broken. The first snow of the season was falling, thick, silent flakes drifting down, blurring the sharp edges of the world, coating her half-built livery in a shroud of white. And from far across the valley, carried on the wind, came the lonely, mournful sound of a train whistle. The new line, the one that mattered. It was a reminder. The railroad was the artery of the West, and the man who controlled that artery controlled the breath of every soul in Red Hollow. Night fell completely. The snow muffled the world. Inside the tack room, Goldie sat on a stool, the lantern casting long shadows. The horses she boarded, only 2, belonging to the blacksmith, muffled and breathed in the temporary stall she'd built. Their quiet presence was a comfort. She took her strap-cutting knife from her toolbox. It was dull. She picked up her whetstone. She worked, pulling the blade across the stone in long, rhythmic strokes. Shing, shing, shing. The sound was steady, meditative. She wasn't preparing for a fight. She was preparing for work. The knife had to be sharp to cut the harness leather she'd use to pay for her next meal. She thought of the smug, damp face of the sheriff. She thought of the invisible, greedy hands of Ephraim Pike, reaching out from his warm bank to snatch the frozen mud from under her feet. She thought of the fiancé who had looked at her, after her father's ruin, as if she were a bill he was declining to pay. The blade sparked. It was sharp now. She tested the edge on her thumb, drawing a thin red line. No one, she whispered to the shadows, to the smell of hay and old leather. No one is taking this roof. Miles away, in a cabin nestled deep in the Blue Lantern Ranch, Silas Crowell sat by a low fire. The same snow was falling outside his window, piling up against the dark pines. He was reading a letter. It was old, the creases worn through, the ink faded. It was the last letter he'd received from his family, back in Ohio. written a year after his wife had succumbed to the fever. It was not a letter of condolence. It was a letter of severance, condemning his choice to stay in this godless land, to abandon his proper life, to let his wife die so far from home. He had never answered it. He folded the letter and put it back in the wooden box with the others. His wife's death hadn't broken his faith in God. It had broken his faith in people. He had chosen this isolation. He preferred the silent company of his horses and the hard, honest logic of the seasons. He looked out at the storm, his sun-warmed eyes reflecting the cold fire. He thought of the woman at the half-built livery. He thought of the fury in her eyes, the set of her jaw, and the blisters on her hands. He recognized the look. It was the look of a person who had drawn a line in the dirt and was willing to die for it. He banked the fire and lay down on his cot, the wind howling around the eaves of the ranch house. He had chosen to live far from the world of men, but the world had a way of pulling you back in. The cold snap held. The snow stopped, but the wind took its place, scouring the valley and turning the frozen mud to iron. Goldie walked to town with the bank's letter clutched inside her coat, the paper a cold weight against her ribs. Ephraim Pike's bank was the only brick building on Main Street. It smelled of floor wax, old paper, and the faint, sweet scent of the cigars Pike smoked in his office. The air was warm, unnaturally still, and Goldie felt her skin prickle. Pike emerged from his office, a man built of soft curves and hard angles. He wore a gray waistcoat, a gold watch chain draped across his stomach. He was all smiles, his voice as smooth as oiled leather. "Miss Harker, a pleasure. Please, come into my office. No need to stand in the cold." She did not move. "I'm here about this notice." She held it out. "Ah, yes, a most unfortunate bit of business." He guided her into the office, closing the door. The room was dominated by a heavy mahogany desk. He sat. He gestured for her to sit. She remained standing. "This note," she said, "was settled in my father's bankruptcy. East." Pike steepled his fingers. "Not quite, I'm afraid. This particular note, tied specifically to the Red Hollow parcel, was overlooked. A clerical error in Boston. It was recently discovered in a portfolio of acquired assets. The bank, as the current holder, is simply required to collect." He slid a new document across the desk. A deed of debt. It was freshly inked. The original sum was barely recognizable, buried under years of compounded interest, late fees, and acquisition charges. The total was an impossible figure, enough to buy half the town. "The interest rate," Goldie said, her voice flat, "is absurd. It's 20%, compounded monthly. So, the standard rate for a high-risk, unsecured note of this age, Miss Harker, regrettable, but legal. I want to see the original ledger, the one from your acquired portfolio." Pike's smile tightened. "Just a fraction. My dear, those are confidential bank records. We have provided you with a certified copy of the obligation. That is all the law requires. I want to see the paper my father signed. And so you shall." He tapped the fresh document. "This is the legally binding transfer of that debt. You have 30 days, or, as Sheriff Brackett may have mentioned, we are prepared to make a generous offer for the land, to clear the slate, so to speak. You want my land for your loading yard." Pike's eyes went cold. The polished civility vanished. "I want what the bank is owed. Miss Harker, the town's future, the railroad's needs that is merely business. This," he tapped the paper again, "is a debt. Pay it, or lose the collateral. Good day." She was being dismissed. She looked down at the new deed, her eyes scanning the text, burning every word into her memory. Pike was a precise man, but the clerk who had drawn this up was sloppy. She saw it instantly. Her father's name, Harker, was misspelled Harkor in the second clause, and the legal term for the land, appurtenance, was spelled with only one P. She memorized the figures. She memorized the errors. She turned and walked out, the heavy door clicking shut behind her, sealing her back into the cold. She bought a handful of nails at the mercantile, the last of her coin. As she left, she glanced across the street at the saloon, the Canary Coal. The windows were thick with grime and smoke, but she could see two men at a corner table. One was Ephraim Pike, the other was a stranger. He was a lean man in a tweed suit, his face sharp and restless. He held a pencil, tapping it against a rolled-up blueprint on the table. He was talking animatedly. Pike was leaning in, listening, his cigar smoke hanging in a cloud above them. Goldie stepped back into the shadow of the mercantile's awning. She couldn't hear most of it, just the rumble of their voices. But then the stranger laughed, a dry, rasping sound, and one phrase cut through the noise as someone opened the saloon door. "Don't matter. Once we have the siding rights, she's boxed in. She'll be paying us to haul her own hay." Pike said something, and the man Goldie recognized him from town gossip as Horace Dugan. A railroad surveyor pointed to his blueprint. "This spur," he said, "is the key, and it runs right through her." Goldie slipped away, her blood colder than the wind. "Siding rights." The words echoed the strange clause in her father's contract. She returned to the livery to find a new problem. The wind had risen to a gale, tearing at the half-finished walls. The sky was a low, bruised purple. And walking toward her, leading a string of 4 thin horses, was Silas Crowell. He looked worse than his animals. His face was chapped raw by the wind, and he moved with a bone-deep weariness. The horses, their ribs showing, huddled together for warmth, their manes whipped by the icy gusts. "Miss Harker," he said, his voice nearly stolen by the wind. She just nodded, her eyes on the horses. "They're half-starved. Wind took the roof off my hay barn 2 nights back," he said, not asking for pity, just stating a fact. "My graze is buried. They'll founder out here before tomorrow." He looked at her open, 3-walled stable. "I need shelter for them. I'll pay." "I told you, I'm not," she started. "I'm not asking for trade." He pulled his gaze from the horses and met hers. "I'm asking for shelter, and I'm not paying with coin. I have none to spare. I'll pay with my back." He nodded toward the pile of raw timber. "You need these walls up before this wind tears the roof off." "I can swing a hammer." It was not charity. It was a barter. Sweat for shelter. The oldest trade in the West. She stared at him, the wind screaming between them. She saw the honesty in his eyes. She saw the desperation in the posture of his horses. She was desperate, too. "The 2 stalls on the left," she said, turning away. "Put them in, then grab a hammer." For the rest of that day, they worked. It was the first time she had ever built anything with another person. The silence between them was vast, filled only by the howl of the wind and the percussive rhythm of their labor. Thud-shing, thud-shing. He was a good carpenter. He didn't waste movements. He didn't ask questions. He saw where a board needed to be held, and he held it. He saw where a joint needed bracing, and he cut the wood. She would measure and mark a beam. He would be there with a saw. He would lift a post. She would be there to set the peg. Their hands, both gloved, both scarred, brushed past each other, grabbing nails from the canvas pouch. They moved like a team that had been doing this for years, not hours. A slow, quiet warmth built between them, a heat generated by shared toil. It was trust, but it was the frontier kind. It wasn't about bearing your soul. It was about knowing the person next to you would hold their end of the timber. He was strong. She'd known that, but he was also patient. When she fumbled a nail, her fingers numb. He didn't sigh or curse. He simply waited for her to set it right, his own hammer resting on his thigh. By the time the bruised sky turned to black, they had a 4th wall. It was rough, but it was solid. It broke the wind. Inside the stable, the air was suddenly still. The horses, hers and his, were safe, munching quietly on the last of Goldie's oats. "I'll take the first watch," Silas said, his voice sounding loud in the new quiet. "Watch for what?" "For trouble." He nodded toward the town. "That sheriff? That banker? They're not the waiting kind." Goldie bristled. "I can watch my own livery. Mr. Crowell." "I know you can," he said, his voice gentle, devoid of pity. "But you're tired, and I'm paying for my horse's lodging. Go, rest. I'll be right here." He settled himself on a hay bale near the door, his back to the wall, pulling his slicker tight. He was not asking. He was stating his terms, exhausted, and for the first time in a year, feeling a strange sliver of safety. Goldie retreated to her tack room. She fell onto her cot, still in her boots, and was asleep before the lantern smoke settled. She woke to silence, a heavy, dead silence. Not the wind, not the horses. She sprang up, her heart pounding. It was hours before dawn. She grabbed her lantern and burst out of the tack room. Silas was on his feet, standing in the middle of the yard. He was looking at her feed supply, or what was left of it. The heavy canvas tarp she used to cover her grain sacks had been slashed to ribbons, slashed, and then pulled back. The oats and corn, her entire stock, the food for her animals and his, had been shoveled out onto the snow-covered mud. It was a frozen, worthless mash. "No," she whispered. The malice of it was breathtaking. They hadn't burned her down. They hadn't hurt her. They had destroyed her ability to work. They had starved her out. Silas said nothing. He walked to the edge of the property, his eyes on the ground. He bent down. "2 men," he said, his voice a low growl. "Shoddy boots. One man's heavier than the other. Came from the direction of the saloon." He looked up, and in the pale lantern light, she saw a cold, hard anger in his eyes that matched her own. "Bracket," she spat. Silas didn't reply. He walked back to the ruined feed. He picked up the slashed tarp, his big hands gentle with the ruined canvas. Then he went to his saddlebags. He pulled out a sailmaker's needle and a spool of heavy, waxed thread. He sat on the hay bale, pulling the edges of the canvas together. He began to stitch. The sound was rhythmic, angry. Punch, pull, cinch. "It's ruined," Goldie said, her voice hollow. "The canvas isn't," he replied, not looking up. "It'll hold a patch. It can cover the hay you'll get. With what money they know I'm broke." He kept stitching. "You'll find a way. This is just canvas. It can be mended." She watched him work, this quiet stranger, mending her tarp in the dead of night, his breath pluming in the cold. He wasn't offering solutions. He wasn't offering hope. He was just doing the next logical thing. He was fixing what was broken. A new resolve hardened in her. They thought this would break her. They were wrong. She went back to the tack room. She pulled out her father's leather portfolio. She had memorized Pike's new false deed. She had memorized the misspellings. Now she looked at her father's old, worthless contract. She read it again, and then she saw it. Not in the main text, but scribbled in the margin, in her father's own frantic hand. Next to the clause about the copper kestrel spur, demurrage citing preference if debts settled at cost by heir. At cost, not at cost plus 20% compounded interest. Not at cost plus Pike's acquisition fees. At cost. It was a kill switch, a hidden clause. Her father, for all his bluster and failed dreams, had seen something. He had negotiated a loophole. If she, the heir, paid the original sum of the debt, the actual, honest principal, she wouldn't just be clear of the note. She would be granted siding preference. She would control the railroad access. Horace Dugan's words came back to her. Once we have the siding rights, they weren't trying to get the land to build a siding. They were trying to get the land to control the siding rights that, they must have assumed, came with it. But the rights didn't belong to the land. They belonged to the heir who settled the debt. They belonged to her. But she needed proof. She needed the original railroad ledgers, the ones Pike refused to show her. And she needed a judge to countersign it, to make it binding before Pike and his misspelled deed could foreclose. A memory surfaced. Her father, years ago, laughing over brandy, speaking of his one honest dealing in the West. A woman judge, Goldie sharp as a tack, honest as a pine knot, up in Hearthstone Bend, a Judge Odessa Kincaid. Remember that name? She knows the railroad charter better than the men who wrote it. Hearthstone Bend. It was 2 days' ride, over the Bitter Sage Ridge, the ridge that was now choked with snow and ice. Impossible. She walked out of the tack room as the first gray light of dawn broke the sky. The wind had died. Silas was just finishing the patch. It was an ugly, brutal thing, a scar of thick thread, but it was whole. He stood up, stretching his back. He looked past her, toward the mountains. "Sky's clear," he said. "The wind will have scoured the pass. It'll be frozen, but it'll be passable." He walked to a battered freight wagon tucked behind her lean-to his wagon. She realized. He'd brought it when he'd brought his horses. "I have to get to Hearthstone Bend," he said, checking the axle grease. "Need to file a water claim and buy seed grain before the land office closes for the winter." Goldie stood frozen. He looked at her. He knew. He didn't know what, but he knew she was holding a piece of a puzzle he couldn't see. "The ride's rough," he said, as if talking to himself. "Better with two, one to drive, one to watch for ice sheets." It was an offer, disguised as a statement of fact. He was offering his wagon, his time, his protection, without her having to ask, without her having to admit she was beaten. She looked at the mended tarp. She looked at the impassable ridge. She looked at this quiet, steady man who had mended her fence before it was even his to mend. Her pride, the Boston pride that had kept her alive, fought against the rising tide of necessity. But this was no longer about pride. It was about survival. It was about the fight. "We leave at dawn," Goldie Harker said. The Bitter Sage Ridge was a spine of broken granite that separated Red Hollow from the rest of the county. The pass was a scar, barely wide enough for a single wagon, slick with ice that the wind had polished to a black sheen. They rode in Silas's freight wagon, the one he used for hauling seed and salt. It was heavy, sturdy, and slow. Goldie sat beside him on the bench, her feet resting on her small leather satchel containing the contract. Silas had wrapped her in a heavy buffalo robe, tucking it around her legs. He had a worn-in canvas slicker over his wool coat. They were close, their shoulders brushing with every lurch of the wagon. The proximity felt necessary, a shared defense against the cold. For the first hour, the only sounds were the creak of the wagon frame, the snap of the brake lever, and the heavy, snorting breaths of the two draft horses. Silas drove with an economy of motion, his large, gloved hands gentle on the reins, his gaze constantly scanning the ice, the sky, the rock face above them. The wagon wheel struck a hidden stone, jarring the bench hard enough to send Goldie slamming into Silas's shoulder. "Sorry," she muttered, righting herself. "This ridge don't apologize," he said, his voice a low rumble. He pulled the team to a halt, setting the brake. "Best let him breathe, and check the rigging." He swung down from the wagon. The silence that descended was vast and absolute, the air so cold it felt thin in the lungs. Goldie watched him move around the wagon, his hands checking the pins, the axles, the harnesses. He was a man who understood the mechanics of survival. He looked up at her, his face chapped red by the wind. "You're quiet." "So are you," she replied. He leaned against the wagon wheel, his gaze distant, fixed on the gray line of the horizon. This land, it takes the words out of you, leaves the facts." He was quiet for a long moment, watching his breath plume. "My wife, Sarah," he said, the name sounding strange and heavy in the frozen air. "She died of the fever, down on the Brazos. We'd been married 18 months. Goldie said nothing. She just watched his face. "It was hot," he said, as if the memory was a surprise. "So hot, not like this. The air was thick. The doctor said it was the swamp air. It took her in 3 days. She was delicate, not made for that life. I brought her there. She believed in destiny. She thought we were meant to be there." He kicked a loose shard of ice. "After she was gone, I stopped believing in destiny. Stopped believing in meant to be. There's just the work, the thing in front of you, the wall that needs building, the horse that needs shoeing, the debt that needs paying." He looked back at her, his sun-cured eyes holding hers. "That's all there is, the work." Goldie understood. He wasn't telling her a sad story. He was telling her his creed. He was explaining who he was. She pulled the buffalo robe tighter. My fiancé, his name was Arthur. Silas waited. My father lost everything. The banks, they took the house, the shipping line, everything. Arthur, he was from a good family. He couldn't be seen with me, the Harker burden. I understood that. She paused, her own gaze turning inward, to a memory that still burned. But he didn't just leave. He left a note. On the hall table. I thought it was a goodbye. It wasn't. Her voice was low, hard as the ice under the wheels. It was a bill, an itemized list. Dinners, theater tickets, the price of a carriage ride. What he had invested in our courtship. He wanted to be reimbursed. He said my father's ruin had put him in a difficult position. He wrote it out, like a shopkeeper's ledger, down to the cent. She looked at Silas. I learned 2 things that day. First, I would never, ever owe anyone anything. And second, that endurance is the only thing that matters. You just endure. Silas held her gaze. He didn't offer pity. He didn't say he was sorry. He just nodded, a slow, profound gesture of understanding. He had told her his creed. She had told him hers. He saw the wall she'd built, and for the first time, he understood the bricks. He straightened up. Well, the work's not done. He climbed back onto the bench. The buffalo robe brushed her arm. This time, when their shoulders touched, it felt different. It was no longer 2 strangers. It was 2 survivors. Hearthstone Bend was twice the size of Red Hollow, a proper town with a 2-story courthouse and boardwalks. Judge Odessa Kincaid's office was on the ground floor, smelling of old paper, stove polish, and strong coffee. The judge herself was a woman in her late 50s, her hair pulled back in a severe gray bun. She wore spectacles, and her eyes, magnified by the glass, missed nothing. Miss Harker, she said, not standing. I received your wire. You believe you have a claim related to the old Iron Mountain charter, a charter I haven't thought about in must be 10 years. Please, sit. Goldie sat. Silas stood by the door, his hat in his hands, a silent shadow. Goldie didn't waste time. She laid the contract on the desk. My father was Abram Harker. I believe this grants me siding preference at the Copper Kestrel Spur, contingent on settling his original debt. Judge Kincaid picked up the contract. Her fingers, stained with ink, traced the faded lines. Abram Harker. Goodness, yes, a man of grand vision and terrible accounting. I remember this. The railroad was desperate for freight partners. They signed anything to get men like your father to build their own sidings. Her fingers stopped on the handwritten clause. And this is his signature. And that is the old territorial seal. She looked up at Goldie over her spectacles. Ephraim Pike sent you a notice. I assume. He did. With a creative interest rate. 20%, I'd wager. The judge said with a dry sniff. Pike's favorite number. He's been buying up these old, dead notes. He's betting no one will read the fine print. He wants that spur. So the clause is valid? Goldie asked, her heart pounding. Oh, it's valid, the judge said, tapping the paper. This pay-at-cost addendum is an ironclad provision of the old territorial charter. It supersedes any local bank's acquired interest. If you as the legal heir present payment for the original principal, Pike's inflated note is nullified. And the siding preference, yes, it transfers to you. Ooh. Goldie felt a rush of air, as if she'd been holding her breath since she'd left Boston. But, the judge said, holding up one finger. The air rushed back in. You cannot pay what you cannot prove. Pike will claim the cost is his new inflated number. You must prove the original debt, the amount your father owed the day this contract was signed. Pike won't give you that ledger. You need the railroad's copy. The railroad went bankrupt, Goldie said, her hope fading. It did. But the stations, the records, they don't just vanish. Your father's last freight run for the Iron Mountain, where was it? Goldie's mind raced. A place he called it Ghost Lantern Gulch. He said it was the end of the line. Judge Kincaid's face grew somber. Ah, yes, Ghost Lantern Gulch. The station shut down 5, maybe 6 years ago, after the unpleasantness, a payroll robbery. Some men were killed. No one goes up there. It's haunted by more than ghosts." She leaned forward. "But the station master, a man named Eli Vance, he was a stickler. He would have locked the ledgers in the station safe before he fled. If that receipt book, the demurrage and haulage ledger, is still there, it will have your father's signature. It will have the at-cost amount. That is your proof." She stamped Goldie's copy of the contract with her own judicial seal. "This confirms my opinion, but it's just an opinion. Get me that ledger, Miss Harker. Get me that ledger, and we will make it the law." The ride back to Red Hollow was faster. The wind was at their backs, and the knowledge of their new purpose gave them speed. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. Ghost Lantern Gulch, it hung in the air between them. They arrived back at the livery as dusk was turning the snow to a deep, bruised blue. The first thing Goldie saw was the patch on her tarp, the ugly, defiant scar. The second was the row of Silas's horses, their heads hanging over their stall doors, safe inside the walls they had built. The work. They spent the next 2 days finishing the stable. The journey had changed them. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. It was the quiet of partnership. They fell into a rhythm that was almost musical. The whine of Goldie's handsaw measuring a plank. The thud, thud, thud of Silas's hammer driving the spike. He would lift a heavy beam. She would be there, bracing it, her smaller, quicker hands setting the shims. It was in this shared labor that the intimacy grew, warmer and stronger than a shouted declaration. He was tending to the horses, running his hands down their legs. Goldie watched him. He had a stillness that the animals trusted. "You have a knack," she said, leaning on a hay rake. He looked up. "They're just honest. They tell you what they need." He motioned her over. "See here." He pointed to the water trough. "You see how the water is clear, but there's a small film on the edge. That's from the feed. Means they're drinking deep, but the water's a day old. It'll sour by tomorrow." He showed her how to tip and scrub the trough, a small, daily act she'd overlooked. "You read the water. It tells you if a horse is sick, or just thirsty." She absorbed the lesson. Later that afternoon, Silas was trying to mount his mare, wincing as his foot hit the stirrup. "You're favoring your right ankle," she said. He grunted. "Old break. This cold it makes the leather bite." She walked over and ran her hand over the stirrup leather. It was stiff as iron. "You're a rancher," she said, "but you treat your tack like a mule skinner. This is your problem." She went to her tack room and returned with a rag and her tin of neat's foot oil. "Give me your foot." He hesitated. She just knelt, grabbed his booted ankle, and placed it on her knee. She worked the oil into the stiff leather, her strong fingers massaging the bend where it met the iron. "You have to work it," she said, her voice practical, focused on the task. "You bend it so it fits the turn of your foot, not the other way around." He sat on the wagon tongue, watching her. He watched her dark hair, escaping its bun. He watched the concentration in her brow. He watched her hands, scarred and capable, working warmth into the cold, dead leather. When she was done, she slapped his boot. "There, try it now." He stood, slid his foot into the stirrup, and mounted. He settled in the saddle, testing the weight. A look of small surprise crossed his face. The pain was gone. "Thank you," he said. "Just work," she replied, mirroring his own words back at him. That evening, she was marking the last beam for the loft. The lantern light was low. She was tired, reaching up, the pencil slipping. She smeared a line of pine tar and charcoal on her cheek. "Hold still," he said. She turned. He was standing closer than she'd realized. Before she could react, he raised his hand. He was ungloved. His thumb, rough and warm, brushed her cheek. It was just a touch, a simple, practical gesture to wipe away a smudge. But it was the first time in her memory that a man had touched her face with uncomplicated kindness. She froze. The air in the stable suddenly stopped moving. She could smell the pine on his skin, the cold night air in his coat. He froze, too, his thumb resting on the curve of her cheekbone. His eyes, the color of sun-cured pine, looked lost in hers. He saw the woman beneath the wall. He pulled his hand back as if he touched a hot stove. "You had sap," he murmured, his voice thick. Goldie's hand went to her cheek. She felt the place his thumb had been. It burned. And then, a sound he had never heard. She laughed. It was not a giggle. It was a low, rusty sound, as if the mechanism for it had been forgotten. It was a laugh of surprise, of nerves, of a tension so deep it had to break. It startled her as much as it did him. The spell was broken, but a new one had been cast. That night, the stable was finished. It was a real building, solid against the wind. Silas brought his horses and Goldie's into the new, clean stalls. He unrolled his bedroll, not in the main stable, but on the small, covered porch outside her tack room door. "The wind's blocked," he said, avoiding her eyes. "I'll be fine here. I can watch the door." He was giving her space. He was respecting her. He was standing guard. Goldie went into her small room and shut the door, but she did not bar it. She sat on her cot. Through the single pane of glass, she could see him. He built a small, clean fire in the yard. He sat with his back against the new wall, his rifle laid across his lap. She watched the firelight trace the strong, stubborn line of his jaw, catching in the rough stubble of his beard. A feeling settled in her chest, one she couldn't name. It was a heat, a deep, slow warmth she had never known. It was not the fire. While she watched him, miles away. Ephraim Pike was also watching. He had a man, a drifter, sitting in the rocks above the livery, reporting on the progress. "They finished the main structure. Mr. Pike," the drifter said. Having returned to the bank, in Pike's office, Horace Dugan unrolled his new, clean blueprint. "It doesn't matter," Dugan said, his pencil tapping the paper. "See here, the new switching line must cross this parcel. Her livery, it's an obstruction. A physical, legal obstruction. Then obstruct her," Pike said, lighting a cigar. The next morning, Sheriff Brackett returned. He didn't ride onto the property. He marched, a clipboard in his hand. "Miss Harker," he barked. Silas, who had been watering the horses, straightened, his hands clenching, but he stayed by the trough. "This is a formal citation," Brackett announced, his voice booming with false authority. "A fire safety inspection. Your new construction, it's a hazard." He stomped into the stable, his muddy boots soiling the clean-swept floor. "This new lumber, it's green. That's a flash risk. Your hay is 2 feet too close to the forge, and this tack room no second exit." He was inventing violations. He was using the law as a cudgel. He was looking for a reason to post a notice, a reason to shut her down. "This is a warning," Brackett sneered, handing her a piece of paper. "You have 24 hours to remedy these violations, or I will lock the premises by order of the county." He smiled, that same wet, sour smile. "You're in over your head, little lady. Still time to sell. Avoid the mess." He turned and marched away. Goldie looked at the citation. She looked at Silas, whose face was thunderous. Then, she dropped the paper in the mud. She walked to the rain barrel at the corner of the stable. The water was icy. She picked up the first of 3 empty buckets she kept for the horses. Calmly, deliberately, she dipped the bucket into the barrel, filling it to the brim. The water slopped over the edge, freezing on her boots. She carried the heavy bucket into the stable and placed it just inside the main door. She went back for the second bucket, and then the third. She lined them up in a perfect, defiant row. Silas watched her, the anger on his face slowly transforming into a deep, profound respect. She was not going to run. She was not going to remedy. She was ready for the fire. The 24-hour deadline from Sheriff Brackett passed. Nothing happened. The silence was louder and more threatening than his voice had been. That night, the cold deepened, settling into the valley like a physical weight. The air was so still it felt sharp in the lungs. Goldie and Silas had taken to sleeping in shifts in the main stable. Silas on his bedroll near the door. Goldie in the tack room, her door left open. The horses were restless, kicking the stall boards, sensing the taut wire of human nerves. It was Goldie who smelled it first. She sat up on her cot, her heart leaping. It wasn't wood smoke. It wasn't the clean scent of pine. It was the greasy, chemical stink of kerosene. "Silas!" she yelled, scrambling for her boots. He was already on his feet, rifle in hand, moving toward the side of the stable. "The grain store," he said, his voice a low growl. She burst out the main door and saw it. A flickering orange light licked up the side wall of the small, separate shed where she kept her bags of oats and corn. It wasn't ablaze yet, just a hungry, determined fire, fed by the pile of oil-soaked rags stuffed beneath the floorboards. "The buckets!" Silas roared, already grabbing two. This was no accident. This was Brackett's remedy. Goldie seized the third bucket, the one she had filled with defiance. She ran to the rain barrel, smashing the ice crust with her fist, plunging the bucket deep. The water was so cold it felt like fire on her skin. Silas was there first, throwing the contents of his two buckets at the base of the flames. The fire hissed, recoiled, and then flared up again, angrier. Goldie arrived, her arms aching. She threw her water, aiming for the burning rags. The flames died, sputtering in a cloud of thick, choking smoke. It was over in 30 seconds. They stood panting, the reek of kerosene and scorched pine stinging their nostrils. The side of the shed was blackened, the wood deeply charred, but it had held. Silas kicked the smoldering rags away from the wall, his boot heels sinking into the mud. They didn't want to burn the stable, not yet. They wanted to destroy your feed, starve you out. Goldie pushed her hair back from her face, her hand coming away black. Ash and soot clung to the strands. Her fury was so cold, so pure, it left no room for fear. This was not a warning. This was an execution, badly aimed. Silas knelt, the lantern held low. They were sloppy. In the half-frozen mud, churned up by the attack, were two sets of boot prints. They were deep, clear, and distinct. One had a worn heel. The other had a peculiar star pattern on the sole. "They went this way," Silas said, his voice devoid of all warmth. He held the lantern high, a tracker on a scent. Goldie followed. The tracks led away from the livery, past the corral, and took the back route toward town. They didn't lead to the saloon. They didn't lead to the sheriff's office. They led, straight as an arrow, to the alleyway behind the Red Hollow Bank and Trust. They ended at the foot of the bank's back door. The silence in the alley was absolute. "So," Goldie whispered, her voice shaking with rage, "Pike doesn't even bother to hide his hounds." Sheriff Brackett arrived an hour later, roused by the report of a disturbance. He made a great show of looking at the damage, his face a mask of official concern. "Terrible business," he said, shaking his head. "Vagrants, no doubt, looking for a warm place." "They were your vagrants, Sheriff," Silas said, his voice flat. He pointed with his rifle barrel. "And they left their calling cards. Tracks lead from here straight to Pike's back door." Brackett's eyes flickered. He couldn't ignore a direct accusation in front of a witness. He huffed. "Now, Crowell, let's not jump to conclusions." He went through the motions, examining the prints in the lantern light. "All right, I'll take a plaster mold. We'll investigate." He fumbled with a small bag, made a messy cast of the star-patterned print, and wrapped it in cloth. "Can't be too careful," he mumbled. "I'll lock this in the evidence cabinet myself. Keys on my desk, safe as the bank." He left. Goldie and Silas said nothing. They both knew. By noon the next day, Goldie went to the sheriff's office to ask about the cast. Brackett met her with a look of profound, theatrical regret. "Well, now, Miss Harker, it's the strangest thing," he said, rubbing his jaw. "I'd swear I put that key right on my desk spike, but it's gone. Must have fallen. The cleaning woman, you know. I'm sure it'll turn up, but for now the cabinet's locked. My hands are tied." His smile was a small, knowing sneer. The evidence was gone. Goldie turned and walked out. She didn't go back to the livery. She went to the telegraph office. She sent a single, terse wire to Judge Kincaid arson attempt. Evidence suppressed by Brackett. Must have ledger, GH. When she returned, Silas was replacing the charred boards on the shed. The rhythmic thud of his hammer was the only sound. "He'll be back," Goldie said, standing in the cold sunlight. The fire was a test. Next time, he won't just aim for the feed. Silas stopped hammering. "I know. He'll wait until we're asleep. He'll bar the door. He needs me gone. He needs my signature off that land." She looked toward the pass. "We can't wait for the judge. We have to go to Ghost Lantern Gulch. We have to get that ledger before they realize it exists and send someone to burn that station, too." Silas drove the nail home in one sharp blow. "You're right." He laid the hammer down. "But we're not going in blind, and we're not leaving this place undefended." He walked to the Mercantile, which housed the town's only telegraph. He sent a message of his own, not to a judge, but to a post office box in Cheyenne. The message was short, a series of codes and numbers. "Who was that?" Goldie asked when he returned. "Man named Ira Beaumont," Silas said, his eyes scanning the ridge above them. "We rode together for a spell. After Sarah, he was a Pinkerton. Saw too much, he said. Now he just finds things. For a price. A detective. A watcher," Silas corrected. "I told him Pike, Dugan, and Brackett. I told him I'm calling in the marker he owes me. He'll watch them. He'll watch this livery while we're gone, and he'll find out what they're planning before they do it." Ira Beaumont arrived 2 days later, not on the stagecoach, but on a bone-tired mule, looking like just another failed prospector. He was a small, wiry man with a face like crumpled paper and eyes that never, ever stopped moving. He wore a rumpled city suit, a derby hat, and no gun. He didn't need one. His weapon was his invisibility. He met Silas behind the livery at dusk. He listened for 5 straight minutes, not saying a word, just nodding, his gaze absorbing every detail: the charred wall, the distant bank, the high ridge. "Pike," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "Hates to lose Dugan, a snake in the grass, but he knows railroad law. Brackett, a blunt instrument, paid in whiskey and ego." He nodded. "You two go to your ghost town. I'll take an interest in architecture. I'll be here." He tipped his derby and, without another word, melted it into the twilight shadows of Red Hollow. The next day, as Goldie was reshoeing one of her own horses, a new shadow fell across the forge. Ephraim Pike. He was alone. He was not smiling, but his face was arranged in an expression of deep, pastoral concern. In his hand, he held a thick, creamy envelope. "Miss Harker," he said, his voice smooth as velvet, "I have come to apologize." Goldie didn't stop her work, just paused the rasp. "For what? Your poor penmanship, or your bad aim with a torch?" Pike's eye twitched. "I assure you, I was appalled to hear of the accident. Truly, this town has ruffians, which is why I am here. This is no life for a woman of your quality." He stepped forward, holding out the envelope. "Mr. Dugan, he was overzealous. His maps were speculative. We are not interested in this parcel." A lie, a bald, stupid lie. "We are. However," Pike continued, "prepared to offer you a substantial sum for your trouble, to compensate you for the loss of your feed, and to help you relocate back east, perhaps." He was close enough now that she could smell his bay rum cologne. "There's enough in here," he said, patting the envelope. "For a new life, a new wardrobe from the catalogs in St. Louis, silks, ribbons, more than enough to live for a whole season. Just sign the deed of sale. We'll forget all about this debt. We'll call it even." It was the bribe. It was Arthur's itemized bill, but in reverse. He was offering her trinkets to buy her silence, to buy her rights. Silas had emerged from the stable. He stood 20 feet away, his arms crossed, a pitchfork leaning against the wall near his hand. He was a silent, unmovable witness. Goldie looked at the envelope. She thought of the burned wall. She thought of the fear she'd felt, and the cold rage that had replaced it. She wiped her hands on her leather apron. She took the envelope from his hand. Pike's face lit with a small, triumphant smile. She then pushed it, hard, back against his starched white shirt. "Get off my land, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying all the weight of the hammer in her hand. "The only thing I want from you is the sight of your back, and tell your men I'm a light sleeper." Pike's face mottled, the civility cracking. He looked at Silas, who hadn't moved. He looked at Goldie, who had already turned back to the horse's hoof. "You are making," Pike hissed, "a catastrophic mistake." "It's my mistake to make," she said, not looking up. "Now, go!" Pike turned, clutching the envelope, and stalked away. Silas watched him go. He walked over to Goldie, who was rasping the hoof with short, angry strokes. "That," Silas said, "was brave. I don't need, and foolish." He finished. She dropped the hoof, her eyes flashing. "Foolish to defend my own." "He won't ask again," Silas said, his voice cutting through her anger, quiet and firm. "He won't send Brackett. He'll send men who know how to finish a job. You made it clear. You're not a nuisance. You're an enemy." Her shoulders slumped. He was right. He stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat from the forge. "But you're not in it alone. I told you that." He waited until she met his eyes. "You're stubborn, Goldie, and you're proud. But you're standing on a cliff, and you just kicked the man who was offering you a rope." "It wasn't a rope," she whispered. "It was a chain." "I know," he said. His voice softened. If you fall, I'll catch you, that's all. I'll catch you." That night, Ira Beaumont reappeared, a ghost in the moonlight. He had news. "He's desperate," Ira whispered, chewing on a piece of straw. Dugan filed his survey maps with the Territorial Land Office. "It's an application for a new siding, right across this plot. But it's got a hole in it." He sketched on the ground with a stick. "The application requires the signature of the primary landowner of record. Pike was going to foreclose, sign it himself, and file it before the Railroad Commission met next month. He's boxed in." "What about my claim?" Goldie asked. "That's the beauty," Ira said, a rare smile splitting his face. "Your father's siding preference. It's a prior claim. It's older, if you can file it, with proof of the settled debt. Before that commission meets, your claim doesn't just block his, it extinguishes it. You don't just keep your land, you get the siding rights. He'd have to pay you." The pieces slammed into place. It was a race. They were leaving at first light. The air in the stable was thick with unspoken words. Sleep was impossible. "We'll need supplies," Goldie said, her voice strained. She picked up a snapped rein from her workbench. "This is broken." "We can't leave it," Silas said. She brought over the strips of new latigo leather. She sat on a hay bale. He sat on the stool opposite her. The lantern cast a single, warm pool of light around them. She started the braid, her fingers fumbling, cold and stiff. "I can't. Here." Silas took the leather strips from her. He started the complex 4-strand plait, but it was awkward for one person. "Hold this end. Pull steady." They began to work together, his large, scarred hands looping the leather, her quick, nimble fingers pulling the braid tight. Pass, cross, pull, tighten. It was a rhythm, like the hammers, like the breathing of the horses. Their hands brushed. Pass, cross. His knuckle grazed her palm. Pull, tighten. Her fingers slipped, landing on his wrist. They both stopped. The distance between them, which had been a workbench, was now just a few inches of braided leather. His knee was almost touching hers. She could see the firelight reflected in his eyes. He could see the soot that still clung to her hair. Slowly, his hands moved over hers, covering them. He didn't pull away. He just held them. Warmth sank into her skin, all the way to the bone. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice rough. "Ghost Lantern Gulch." "Tomorrow?" she agreed, her voice barely a whisper. They finished the rain in silence. It was strong and perfect. Outside, the north wind began to howl. scraping against the new wooden roof. It sounded like a train whistle. It sounded like a secret, trying to stay buried. They were ready to leave before the sun. The air in the stable was brittle, expectant. Silas had the team hitched to the freight wagon, the one he'd used to bring them to Hearthstone Bend. Goldie was packing the last of the dry biscuits and a skin of water. Her movements sharp, her nerves stretched tight as a new cinch. Ira Beaumont had vanished, a ghost into the town's shadows, leaving them to their own grim task, Ghost Lantern Gulch. The name itself felt like a bad omen. Goldie was tying the satchel to the wagon rigging when the wind changed. It didn't rise, it stopped. For a full 10 seconds, Red Hollow fell into a dead, pressurized silence. The horses felt it, their ears flattening, their eyes rolling. "Silas," Goldie said, her voice quiet. "I know." He was looking north, at the ridge. A low, gray-white wall of cloud was advancing, not rolling, but moving like a solid thing, an avalanche in the sky. "Get the horses, get them inside, now!" The silence broke. It was not a wind, but a physical impact. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a minute. The first flakes were not flakes at all, but tiny, hard pellets of ice that stung the skin. Then the world vanished. The blizzard hit the livery like a freight train. The sound was a deafening, solid roar. "The doors!" Silas bellowed over the howl. Shoving the last draft horse into the central aisle, they fought the main doors together, the wind trying to rip the wood from their hands. It took both their weights, straining against the bar, to slam it shut and drop the heavy wooden crossbeam. They were sealed in. The stable, which had seemed so solid and safe, now felt like a wooden box in a rapids. The wind screamed through the new planks, finding every tiny gap, every knot. Snow began to jet in through the cracks in fine, powdery streams. The horses screamed, a high, thin sound of terror. "They'll hurt themselves," Goldie yelled, her voice raw. This was her domain. She grabbed a fistful of burlap sacking. "We have to calm them. We have to block the drafts." For the next hour, they worked. They didn't talk. They moved. This was the work. This was survival. Goldie went from stall to stall, her hands on the animals, her voice a low, steady murmur. She rubbed them down, her strong fingers working warmth into their shivering hides. She spoke to them of oats, of summer grass, of safety. She was their anchor, her own fear channeled into a fierce, protective calm. Silas, meanwhile, became an architect against the storm. He took the patched tarp, the one he had mended, and began nailing it against the windward wall, the one they had built together. The thud, thud, thud of his hammer was a defiant heartbeat against the roaring wind. He stuffed rags, straw, anything he could find, into the gaps between the boards, trying to stop the biting jets of snow. The stable was dark, lit only by the one lantern they dared keep lit, its flame guttering wildly in the drafts. The air was a maelstrom of hay dust, ice particles, and the hot, rank smell of terrified animals. Goldie was finishing with Silas's mare, the last one. She had thrown a heavy wool blanket over the horse's back. The mare, calmer now, lipped at her sleeve. "It's all right," Goldie whispered, resting her forehead against the animal's warm neck. "It's all right. We're safe in here." She turned, exhausted, her muscles aching from the cold and the tension. Silas was standing on a stool, trying to secure a high rafter where the wind was peeling back a shingle. She picked up the empty water bucket, meaning to break the ice on the barrel, to make sure they had water if this lasted for days. She was stiff. Her boots were slick with mud and half-frozen snow. She took one step and her foot slipped on a patch of ice she hadn't seen. It was a clumsy, undignified fall. Her feet went out from under her, and she cried out, her arms flailing for balance. Silas was off the stool in an instant. He moved with a speed she could not have imagined, crossing the 3 yards between them before she could hit the ground. He didn't just catch her, he enveloped her. His arm clamped around her waist like a steel band, stopping her fall, lifting her off her feet and pulling her hard against his chest. The impact drove the air from her lungs. She was pressed against the solid, unyielding wall of his body. He was so warm. Through her thick wool coat, she could feel the heat of him, the sheer, solid strength that had been hammering and hauling and fighting beside her for days. The world stopped. Outside, the blizzard roared, a forgotten, distant noise. Inside, the only sound was the heavy, gasping breath of two people who had just avoided disaster. The air between them was thick with the scent of dry hay, the clean, sharp smell of the pine resin on his hands, and the cold, metallic tang of the storm. He held her, his arm locked around her waist. His other hand was splayed against her back, holding her steady. She was clutching his shoulders, her fingers digging into the canvas of his slicker. "You're safe," he breathed. His voice was a low vibration against her ear. "I've got you." She was safe. The words echoed in her mind. He wasn't her father, full of grand, empty promises. He wasn't Arthur, tallying her cost. He was Silas. He had mended her tarp. He had faced down Pike. He had built her wall. He had caught her. This was not the plan. This was not the work. This was something else. Something that had been building in the silence, in the shared labor, in the quiet exchange of their broken histories. She was exhausted. She was terrified of what waited in Ghost Lantern Gulch. She was so tired of being strong. For the first time since she'd stepped off that train in Boston, Goldie Harker let go. She didn't pull away. She leaned into him. She turned her head, her face buried in the rough wool of his collar. Her hand, the one on his shoulder, slid up. Her cold fingers found the back of his neck, his hair rough against her skin. And then, in a gesture of pure, unthinking gratitude that was also a lifetime of pent-up yearning, she moved. She pressed her lips, chapped and cold, to his jawline. It was not a practiced kiss. It was a brand, a desperate, silent thank you. A confirmation of his truth. She felt the rough stubble of his beard, the warmth of his skin. She felt the solid bone beneath. Silas went rigid. A sound tore from his throat, a low groan of disbelief. He had been holding her in protection. She had just changed the terms of the treaty. "Goldie," he whispered. The name was rough, a prayer. She didn't move, her lips still pressed to his skin, her eyes squeezed shut. She was trembling. His response was not one of thought. It was instinct. It was the answer to a question he hadn't dared ask. His hand, the one on her back, slid lower, settling on the curve of her hip. His other hand, the one locked around her waist, released its grip only to move. He didn't grope. He acted. His large, calloused hand found the hem of her heavy wool skirt. He slid his hand beneath the outer layer, his knuckles brushing the strong, practical muslin of her petticoat, the layers she wore against the cold, against the world. His palm found the solid, strong line of her thigh. He pressed his hand against her, his warmth searing through the fabric. He wasn't exploring. He was anchoring. He lifted, just slightly, pulling her even closer, pulling her leg against his, fitting her body to his, flush against the wall of the stable. It was not a violation. It was a claiming, a hot, desperate protection that ran straight through the layers of wool and muslin. She gasped against his skin. He lowered his head. His mouth found hers. This was not the chaste kiss to the jaw. This was the storm. Brought inside, it was a kiss of hunger, of loneliness, of two people who had forgotten what it meant to be touched. It was slow and deep and desperate. It tasted of the cold air and the warmth beneath. His lips were firm, chapped like hers, but they were not tentative. He was a man who had made a choice. Her hands, no longer just grateful, wrapped around his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. The stable, the storm, the danger, it all dissolved, leaving only this, the heat, the solid wall of the man who held her. They stood pressed against the rough-hewn timber, their heartbeats slamming against each other like frantic, galloping hooves. The world was reduced to the space they occupied. He kissed her again, and again, long, slow, drowning kisses that spoke of all the years they had been alone. His hands roamed her back, over the thick coat, learning the shape of her. Holding her so tightly she felt her feet leave the floor. His hands settled on her lower back, bracing her, supporting her, holding her up against the world. She was shaking, not from cold, but from the raw, overwhelming force of it. This was real. This was not a bill to be paid. This was a truth. She broke the kiss, gasping, pressing her forehead to his. Her breath came in ragged sobs. "Silas," she whispered. "I'm here." "Don't," she pleaded, her voice thick. "Don't promise me anything. No grand futures." "No promises of safety. I can't bear them." She was thinking of Arthur's bill, of her father's failed dreams. No promises, just the truth. He pulled back, just enough to see her face in the wild, flickering lantern light. His eyes, the color of cured pine, were dark with an emotion she had never seen. "The truth," he said, his voice rough. "The truth is, I stopped believing in meant to be when my wife died. I stopped believing in destiny. I only believe in the work." He brushed the soot-stained hair from her face, his touch agonizingly gentle. "The truth is, I choose you. Goldie Harker, I choose this. This is not destiny. This is a fact. This is the work I choose." He kissed her again, gently this time, sealing the vow. And as if in response, the wind outside seemed to take a breath. The high-pitched scream dropped to a low, steady howl. The pressure in the stable eased. They stood, wrapped in each other's arms, their breathing slowly returning to normal. They didn't let go, not completely. A small, awkward smile touched Goldie's lips. It was real. Silas smiled back, a slow, rusty smile that transformed his weary face. The love had taken shape. It was not a fragile, pretty thing. It was made of wood and steel and patched canvas. It was a shelter, and it was safe. "The horses," Goldie murmured, her voice still thick, resting her head on his shoulder. "They're fine," he said, his hand stroking her hair. "The wind's dropping." They finally stepped apart, the cold air rushing into the space between them, but the warmth remained. "We need a fire," Silas said, his voice practical, though his eyes still held the fire. "A small one, in the forge. It's safe there." He built it while she checked the animals one last time. The horses were quiet, their terror gone, replaced by the steady, munching sound of hay. They sat on a single hay bale, shoulder to shoulder, in front of the small, contained fire in the blacksmith's forge. The heat felt good on their faces. Silas reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the biscuits she had packed. He broke one in half and handed her a piece. It was hard, dry cornbread. They ate in silence, but the silence was different. It was no longer the empty, wary space between two strangers. It was full. It was the warm, comfortable quiet of two people who had chosen. The firelight played on their faces. She watched the strong line of his jaw, the one she had kissed. He watched the soft curve of her cheek, the one he had touched. They sat like that for hours, the storm howling itself to sleep, the fire burning down to embers, the horses breathing softly in the dark. When the first, pale, gray light of dawn filtered through the cracks Silas had not been able to fill, the world was silent. The storm had passed. They stood up, their bodies stiff from the cold and from sitting so long. They looked at each other. The night had happened. It was real. Silas picked up the satchel. "Ghost Lantern Gulch," he said. Goldie nodded, pulling on her heavy gloves. "Let's go get that ledger." They barred the stable, leaving the horses safe, and stepped out into a new world. The snow piled in drifts as high as their chests. The fight was not over. It had just truly begun. The ride to Ghost Lantern Gulch was a slow-motion battle. The blizzard had passed, leaving the world scoured, silent, and buried under 4 feet of dense, heavy snow. They didn't take the wagon. They took the horses. Silas's strong mare breaking the trail, Goldie's gelding following in her wake. The silence was absolute. broken only by the rhythmic, plunging huff of the horses and the squeak of cold leather. It took them half the day to cover a distance that should have taken 2 hours. The sun was a weak disk in a white-gray sky, offering no warmth. Ghost Lantern Gulch was not a town. It was a graveyard. The unpleasantness Judge Kincaid had mentioned was visible everywhere. The saloon was a collection of burned timbers. The other buildings stood gap-toothed, their windows smashed, their doors kicked in. The snow had softened the edges, but it could not hide the violence. The robbers had torn the place apart looking for the payroll. The train station, however, stood apart. It was built of stone, a squat, stubborn building designed to withstand the high country winters. It was the only structure that looked whole. They wouldn't have burned the station, Silas said, his voice low. It was railroad property. Too much trouble. They dismounted, their legs stiff. The horses, coated in sweat despite the cold, blew hard, their breath steaming. The main door of the station was shut. The heavy iron padlock was still in place, its surface a thick, uniform crust of orange rust. "It's locked," Goldie said, her heart sinking. "Just from the outside." Silas replied. He took the heavy pry bar from his saddle ties, a tool meant for shoeing draft horses. He didn't bother with the lock. He jammed the flat end of the bar between the door jamb and the heavy iron hinge. "Stand back." He put his shoulder and all his weight into it. The wood around the hinge screamed. The old, dry pine splintered, with a sound like a gunshot. The top hinge ripped free from the jamb. He did the same to the bottom. The heavy door groaned and sagged inward, scraping a half circle in the dusty floor. They stepped inside. The air was dead, cold, and smelled of rats, old paper, and something metallic, like rust and decay. Snow had blown in through a broken window at the far end, piling up on the telegrapher's desk. But the station master's office, as Kincaid had guessed, was a separate room, its door shut. "Wait here," Silas said, his hand on the butt of his rifle. He moved through the main room, checking the shadows. Goldie didn't wait. She went straight to the station master's door. This lock was smaller, internal. Silas joined her. He didn't pry this one. He raised his heavy boot and kicked, just once, next to the handle. The jamb splintered like kindling, and the door swung open. The room was chaos. The robbers had been here. They had emptied the desk, torn open cabinets. Paper was everywhere, a sea of yellowed bills of lading, schedules and memos, trampled and stained. They were looking for the safe key, Silas murmured. He pointed to the corner, where a heavy black iron safe sat, its door still shut. "It won't be in the safe," Goldie said, her voice sharp with focus. "Kincaid said he was a stickler. He would have locked the ledgers away, but the payroll that would be separate—" She began to sift, not through the mess on the floor, but through the ledgers that had been pulled from a shelf and thrown in a heap. Her gloves, stiff with cold, made the work clumsy. She tore them off, her bare hands instantly numb. Freight logs, passenger manifests, maintenance reports. Silas, the lantern. He lit it. The flickering yellow light was weak, but it was enough. She found a stack of tall, narrow books in the back corner, the ones the robbers had ignored. The spines were covered in mildew. Her finger traced the faded gold leaf. Demurrage haulage. 1878, 1879. "This one?" she whispered. 1880. The year her father had signed his contract. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the pages. The paper was brittle, the ink faded to brown. She ran her finger down the alphabetical index. H. Halloway Harker. Page 117. She flipped, and there it was. It was not a grand document. It was a single-line entry in a book full of them. Harker, Abram. Freight contract 44B. Haulage of milled pine, and next to it, the numbers, the original shipping fee. And then a second entry, dated 6 months later. Account 44B, principal debt offset per territorial charter provision, balance 0. It was signed by the station master, and beneath it, stamped in faded purple ink, was the official seal of the Iron Mountain Railroad. The same faint, distinctive eagle crest that was on her father's contract. At cost, she breathed, tracing the words. He had paid it. Her father had paid the real, original debt, and the railroad had logged it. Pike's entire claim, his compounded interest, his 20%, it was all built on a lie. She didn't just have the contract. She had the receipt. "We have it," she said, looking up at Silas. The relief and triumph in her voice was so profound it was almost a sob. She clutched the heavy book to her chest. Silas's face broke into a slow, rare smile. He reached out, his bare hand covering hers on the book. "You did it, Goldie. You—" He stopped. His head snapped up. From outside, faint but clear in the dead silence, came the sound of a horse whinnying, and then a man's curse. "Company," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low growl. He was already moving, blowing out the lantern, plunging the room back into gray twilight. He peered through the cracked, grimy window of the main room. "It's Brackett," he said, "and 2 deputies. They're dismounting." "How?" Goldie panicked, her eyes wide. "How did they know?" "Pike's not stupid. He must have had a man watching the ridge. He knew where we were going." Silas shoved the heavy ledger into Goldie's satchel. "There's no time to ride. We have to—" "Trespassers," Brackett's voice boomed from outside. "By authority of the county and as agents of the Union Pacific Railroad, I order you to come out." Silas looked around, his eyes frantic. He grabbed Goldie's arm. "The loading dock, the window on the roof." "Silas, no, I won't. Go." He shoved her toward the back of the station, where freight was once loaded. "There's a ladder to the inspection cupola. Get on the roof. Get to the horses. They're still on the far side. Take my mare. She's the fastest. Ride for Hearthstone Bend. Ride for Kincaid. What about you? I'll stall him." He gave her one last, hard look. "Don't stop, for anything. Go." The main door, the one Silas had broken, crashed inward. Sheriff Brackett stood in the doorway, his pistol drawn. Well, Crowell and Miss Harker, rooting through railroad property. That's a federal offense." Silas stepped in front of Goldie, shielding her from view. He held his rifle loosely, pointed at the floor. "We were caught in the storm. Sheriff, looking for shelter." "Shelter?" Brackett laughed. A wet, ugly sound. "In the station master's private office, you're under arrest, both of you." As Brackett stepped forward, Silas saw Goldie scramble up the ladder in the shadows. He had to hold them. "On what charge?" "Brackett," Silas said, not moving. "This is a dead town. You have no jurisdiction here. My jurisdiction is wherever Mr. Pike pays me to be." Brackett sneered. "And he's very interested in what you're holding. Miss Harker—" Goldie was at the top. She pushed at the small roof window. It was frozen shut. "It doesn't matter, anyway," Brackett said, advancing. He was enjoying this. "We got the wire from Dugan's lawyer not an hour ago. He's a smart one. He filed an injunction with the Territorial Commission." Silas's blood went cold. "What injunction?" "Seems the commission set a deadline for any prior claims on that spur. Statute of limitations. Your little ghost contract." Brackett grinned, tapping his watch. "It expires today, at 5 o'clock. You've got 3 hours to file it with Judge Kincaid. And you're here. Such a shame." The trap. It wasn't just finding the book. It was the deadline. Goldie heard it. 3 hours. She didn't hesitate. She slammed the butt of her fist into the glass of the cupola window. The pane shattered, the sound lost in the wind. "What was that?" Brackett's deputy yelled. "Now! Silas!" Goldie screamed. Silas moved. He didn't shoot. He lunged, using his rifle like a staff, shoving the barrel hard into Brackett's soft middle. The sheriff let out a huge woof and staggered back, colliding with his deputies. "Get her!" Brackett roared. Silas didn't run. He blocked the doorway to the loading dock, a solid, unmovable object. "You'll have to get through me." "Sheriff!" Goldie dropped from the roof onto the snowy loading dock. She ran, half falling, half sliding through the deep snow, to the horses. She cut her own gelding loose, slapping its rump. "Go!" She fumbled with the mare's reins, her hands bloody from the glass, and hauled herself into the saddle. One of the deputies burst from the side of the station, raising his pistol. Silas was right behind him. He tackled the man, a clean, hard impact that sent them both sprawling into a snowdrift. The deputy's pistol fired, the bullet whining harmlessly into the sky. "Ride, Goldie, ride." She kicked the mare, plunging her into the deep snow, back toward the pass. Silas scrambled to his feet, ran to his horse Goldie's gelding, and mounted. Brackett and the other deputy were right behind him, firing now. The chase was a nightmare. The horses floundered in the deep powder, their lungs burning. But Silas's mare was strong, and Goldie was light. She pulled ahead. Silas, on the slower horse, knew they wouldn't make it. Brackett was gaining. He saw the turnoff, a narrow gap in the rocks. Coyote split. "Goldie!" he roared. "To me! The split!" She yanked the mare's head. Turning, Silas cut in front of her, grabbing her rein. "Hold on." He plunged the horses off the main trail, into a narrow, winding canyon. It was a goat track, slick with ice, the walls barely wider than his shoulders. It was madness, but it cut 5 miles off the ridge. Brackett and his men skidded to a halt at the opening. They looked down the icy, treacherous path. "He's insane," the deputy yelled. "We'll break our necks." "Let them," Brackett spat, reining his horse around. "They can't make it. We'll take the pass. We'll still beat them to Hearthstone Bend and arrest them there." The ride through Coyote Split was a blur of terror. The horses slid, scrambled, their iron shoes striking sparks on the rock. Goldie closed her eyes, clutching the satchel to her chest, trusting the mare, trusting Silas. They emerged at the bottom, bruised, terrified, but alive, and miles ahead of the law. The clock on the Hearthstone Bend courthouse was striking the quarter hour. 4:45. They burst into the courthouse, slamming the doors open. They were covered in snow, ice, and, in Goldie's case, dried blood. Judge Kincaid's clerk, a mild man named Gable, looked up in horror. "The judge!" Goldie gasped. They stumbled into her chambers. Judge Kincaid was putting on her coat. A slick man in a city suit, Dugan's lawyer, was smiling, packing his briefcase. "Ah, Miss Harker." The lawyer smiled. "Too late. The deadline for filing your archaic claim is 5 o'clock. A motion I filed myself. You have 10 minutes, Judge Kincaid said, her face grim. Goldie threw the heavy, mildewed ledger on the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. Page 117, Judge Ghost Lantern Gulch, demurrage and haulage, 1880. The lawyer's smile vanished. Judge Kincaid tore her gloves off. She opened the book. Her finger, stained with ink, ran down the page. She stopped. She read the entry. She looked at the seal. She looked at Goldie's contract, which was still on her desk. "Mr. Gable," the judge said, her voice sharp. "Yes, ma'am. Witness this." She pulled Goldie's siding preference application from a drawer. She took her judicial seal and slammed it down on the paper. Thump. "The preference provision is clear," Kincaid said, her voice ringing in the silent room. "It is valid upon proof that the at-cost debt was settled by the heir's predecessor. This ledger is that proof." She signed her name with a flourish. Thump. She stamped it again. "What time is it, Mr. Gable?" The clerk looked at the wall clock. "It is 4:59. Judge." "Filed," Judge Kincaid said, handing the validated, notarized, and legally binding application to Goldie. "With 1 minute to spare, Mr. Gable, wire the Territorial Commission immediately. Register this claim. Effective as of this moment. Good day, gentlemen." Dugan's lawyer was the color of ash. That night, a wire came for them at the Hearthstone Hotel. It was from Ira Beaumont. "Pike is moving. Hired a crew. Bringing in heavy timbers and switching gear. He thinks he's won. Brackett is on his payroll. Full time. They plan to start laying track at dawn. Be careful." Goldie read the telegram. She looked at Silas, who was wrapping her cut hand with a clean bandage. Pike was moving onto her land. He was setting his trap. not knowing the law had just snapped a different one around his own leg. Silas finished the bandage, his touch gentle. He looked at her, his sun-cured eyes meeting hers. He saw the iron in her, the exhaustion, the fight. "From here on out," he said, his voice quiet, his hand resting on hers. "You are not alone." The snow-scoured air of Red Hollow was sharp with the smell of pine and coal smoke, but by mid-afternoon, a new sound had polluted it. Tinny, brittle music from a brass quartet, playing badly out of tune, drifted from the flatlands by the station. Ephraim Pike had decided his victory was so certain, he would celebrate it before it was even final. He had spared no expense, or at least, he had spared no expense that he couldn't later build to the railroad. A rough pine platform had been erected just yards from Goldie's property line. Right on the contested easement, a banner, flapping stiffly in the wind, declared "The future of Red Hollow Pike Dugan Rail Services." Barrels of whiskey, free to any man who'd stand and listen, had been rolled out. Horace Dugan was on the platform, his sharp face flushed with victory, accepting congratulations. Sheriff Brackett, his badge gleaming, stood at the steps, acting as a grinning, self-important guard, a tin of cheap whiskey in his hand. A thin crowd had gathered. They were mostly drifters from the Canary Coal, men who would cheer for any man who provided free liquor. The town's more solid citizens, the blacksmith, the mercantile owner. The ranchers stood at a distance, watching, their faces guarded. They smelled the arrogance, and it soured the air more than the whiskey. Pike stepped onto the platform, raising his hands for quiet. The music stumbled to a halt. "Friends, citizens of Red Hollow," Pike boomed, his voice slick and practiced. "Today, we usher in a new era of prosperity. The Union Pacific has chosen us." He gestured to Dugan. "To build the new, modern loading yard this town deserves." Dugan stepped forward, unrolling a large blueprint. "This siding," he announced, "will be the artery of commerce. We begin construction immediately." A thin, paid-for cheer went up from the men by the barrels. "And now," Pike said, his eyes gleaming with malice, "our first order of business is to remove the obstructions." He turned, gesturing with a theatrical sweep of his arm, directly at the Harker livery. "The regrettable, hazardous structures blocking our progress." He was met with a wall of silence. Into that silence, 3 figures walked. They had not come from the road. They had walked directly from the livery. Goldie Harker led them. She was not dressed for a party. She wore the same dark wool coat she had worn in the blizzard, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face, cut by the wind and pale with resolve, looked like that of a judge walking to a hanging. Beside her, his steps matching hers, was Silas Crowell. He wore his canvas slicker, and his eyes, cold and clear as pine, were fixed on Brackett, behind them, looking almost bored, was the wiry, small figure of Ira Beaumont, his derby hat pulled low, and fanning out from behind the livery, appearing as if from the frozen earth itself, came 6, then 7 more men. They were high-country ranchers, men with faces like cured leather, the men of Blue Lantern Ranch and their neighbors, men who owed Silas a marker, or who simply hated Ephraim Pike. They were sober, silent, and they carried no banners. They just appeared. Dugan saw Goldie and his face split in a condescending smirk. "Ah, Miss Harker. Come to see the future. Don't worry, we'll give you a fair price for the salvageable timber." Goldie ignored him. She ignored Pike. She ignored the platform entirely. Her gaze was fixed on a harried-looking man in a railroad cap who was standing near the tracks, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Finley, the station master." She walked straight to him. "Mr. Finley," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with absolute clarity in the sudden hush. Finley turned, startled. "Miss Harker, I really can't." She held out the folded, heavy vellum paper. The seal of Judge Kincaid was bright red against the white. "Mr. Finley, as the legal representative of the Union Pacific Railroad in Red Hollow, you are being served." Finley's face went white. He took the paper as if it were a snake. "That," Goldie announced, her voice rising slightly, turning now to include the crowd, "is a court-validated, territorially registered siding preference, filed at 4:59 p.m. yesterday in Hearthstone Bend." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. The drifters looked confused, but the blacksmith, the mercantile owner, they understood. They began to move closer. "This is," Finley stammered, his eyes scanning the document. He saw the seal. He saw Judge Kincaid's signature. He was a man of rules and schedules. And this paper screamed authority. This is a prior claim." "That's right," Goldie said. "The preferential rights to all loading and demurrage at the Copper-Kestrel Spur belong to the Harker livery, by right of a settled contract from 1880, effective immediately." Pike's face, which had been flushed with triumph, went pale. "What?" Dugan shouted, jumping off the platform. "That's absurd. That's illegal." "That's enough," Brackett roared, his whiskey courage surging. He saw his payday vanishing. He lunged, not at Goldie, but at Finley, his hand outstretched to snatch the document. "Give me that paper. That's evidence." Silas moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stepped sideways, his body a solid wall, blocking Brackett's path to the station master. "Don't, Sheriff," Silas said, his voice a low, cold rumble. Brackett stumbled to a halt, his chest nearly striking Silas's. "Get out of my way. Crowell, that's an order." At that moment, the 7 ranchers from the Blue Lantern, who had been filtering through the crowd, moved as one. They didn't run. They just stepped forward. They formed a silent, loose semicircle, their backs to Goldie and Finley, their faces to Brackett. They were unmovable. 7 men, sober and hard, standing shoulder to shoulder. They hadn't drawn their guns. They didn't need to. They were a line, and they would not be crossed. Brackett froze, his hand dropping. He was one drunken man against 8. He looked around, suddenly realizing his authority was nothing but a piece of tin. "This is a joke!" Dugan screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. He pointed a shaking finger at Goldie. "That contract is ancient. It's null. It's void. It's obsolete." He turned to Finley, his voice pleading. "Finley, you work for the railroad if you honor that. Pike and I will have your job. We'll—" "He is incorrect, Mr. Dugan." The voice was female, sharp as an icicle, and carried the effortless authority of absolute power. The crowd parted. Judge Odessa Kincaid stood at the edge, her arms folded. She, too, had driven from Hearthstone Bend, though her buckboard was cleaner than their horses. She walked forward, stopping at the foot of the platform. She looked up at the slack-jawed Ephraim Pike. "The Territorial Railroad Charter, Mr. Pike," the judge said, as if addressing a slow student, "is quite clear. Prior preference contracts, when proven settled at cost, supersede any and all subsequent claims, acquisitions, or liens." That's not," Dugan stammered. "It is," Kincaid said, cutting him off. "I direct your attention to the precedent set in Sagebrush County versus the Denver Midland Line. 1878, a case I tried myself. The precedent holds. Your lawyer's injunction, Mr. Dugan, was denied by the commission in Cheyenne this morning. My wire, it seems, arrived first." She turned to the station master, who looked as if he might faint. "Mr. Finley, that document Miss Harker gave you is the law. You will obey it." But, Judge," Finley said, his voice trembling as he pointed to the massive stacks of new-cut timber, the iron rails, and the heavy switching frogs Pike had piled directly on the siding easement. "Mr. Pike's materials, they're already here. They're blocking the right-of-way." A small, cold smile touched Judge Kincaid's lips. "Then they are trespassing on private preference property. They are subject to immediate impoundment." She paused, letting the words sink in. "And, of course, they are subject to demurrage." The word hung in the cold air. Pike looked as if he'd been shot. Demurrage. The fee for obstructing a rail line. The very fee he and Dugan had planned to use to bankrupt Goldie. Goldie stepped forward. She looked past the ranchers, past the silent Silas, and locked her eyes on Ephraim Pike, who was still standing on his useless platform, his party banner flapping mockingly above him. "That's right, Mr. Pike," Goldie said, her voice clear and cold. "The standard railroad demurrage fee, charged by the hour. For every hour your materials sit on my siding, you will be charged by the railroad, who will then be required to remit those fees to me." The crowd was dead silent. The financial knife was in, or, Goldie continued, "You can rent the siding from me starting today, at the rate I set." She named a figure, a number so high it made the crowd gasp. "The choice is yours. Pay the fee or pay my rent. Either way, you will pay me." The magnificent, arrogant composure of Ephraim Pike finally, completely shattered. His face, which had been pale, turned a sickly, mottled red. The financial trap was perfect. He was ruined. The cost of the delay or the cost of her rent would wipe out his entire profit. He was beaten. But Brackett was not. Brackett was a simpler creature. He was a bully, and he was cornered. His patron was dying. "No!" Brackett roared, his face purple. He did the only thing a man like him knows how to do. He reached for his authority. He yanked his pistol from its holster. "This is a conspiracy!" he screamed, waving the gun wildly. Not at Goldie, but at the line of ranchers. "This is an illegal assembly. I'm arresting all of you. Disperse! Disperse! By God! Or I'll—" The crowd didn't move. The ranchers didn't move. Silas didn't even blink. A voice, deep and slow, came from the back of the crowd. It was the blacksmith. "Is that the same gun you used to arrest the men who tried to burn Miss Harker's barn?" "Sheriff, yeah, Brackett," another voice called. "How's that lost key? You find it yet?" "We all saw the smoke." "Brackett," a woman yelled. "We saw your thugs that night. We're not blind." The town, silent for so long, had finally found its voice. The tide had turned. Brackett was no longer a lawman. He was just a thug with a gun, standing alone. "That's slander," he shrieked, his eyes wild. "There's no proof. You've got no proof." "Actually, Sheriff," a new voice said. It was Ira Beaumont, stepping calmly out from behind Silas. He opened the small leather satchel he carried. "There's quite a bit." He held up a glass plate photograph. It was a close-up, sharp and clear, of the star-patterned boot print in the mud outside the burned feed shed. "Proof, you said?" Ira asked, his voice mild. He held up a second photograph. "This is one of your deputies, Jed Slocum. Taken yesterday, outside the Canary. Note the boots, a perfect match." The crowd oohed. Brackett's face went from purple to gray. "And," Ira continued, his voice relentless, "a desperate man gets thirsty." He pulled out a piece of paper. "This is the bar receipt from the Canary Coal, from the night of the fire, for 3 men, your men. A generous bonus for services rendered, signed by you, Sheriff." It was checkmate. The crowd surged forward, not as a mob, but as a jury. They were no longer afraid. "Sheriff Brackett," Judge Kincaid said, her voice like a hammer blow. "Given the evidence, photographic and documentary, of conspiracy to commit arson, destruction of property, and suppression of evidence, you are hereby relieved of duty, pending a full investigation by the Territorial Marshal." She looked at one of the tall Blue Lantern ranchers. "Mr. Coulter, please secure his weapon, and his badge." Brackett didn't resist. He was broken. His hand hung limp. The rancher named Coulter walked forward, calmly took the pistol from Brackett's unresisting fingers, and tucked it into his own belt. Then, with 2 fingers, Coulter unpinned the tin star from Brackett's vest. He held it for a moment. Then he tossed it onto the platform. It landed at Pike's feet with a small, pathetic clink. Brackett, his face empty, was shouldered by 2 of the ranchers and quietly marched toward the jail. Horace Dugan was already gone. Seeing the tide turn, the railroad man had slipped off the back of the platform, gathered his blueprints, and vanished, melting away. leaving Pike alone to face the music. Pike stood on his platform, his grand celebration in ruins. The crowd was just watching him. The silence was deafening, and from down the valley, carried on the cold, clear air, came the sound, the long, mournful, inevitable wail of the 3 o'clock freight train, the train carrying the next shipment of Pike's lumber, the train that was about to start costing him a fortune. By the hour, the time of reckoning had arrived. The train whistle was no longer a mournful, distant cry. It was a shriek, loud and immediate, as if summoned by the dropping of Brackett's badge. The locomotive chugged into view, its single bright eye cutting through the sudden, returning squall of snow. The wind had picked up, driving icy pellets that stung the faces of the stunned crowd. The party was over. The trial had begun. Mr. Finley, the station master, snapped to attention, his professional duty overriding his fear. He looked at the validated order in his trembling hand. He looked at the massive engine steaming toward him. He looked at the piles of timber and steel Pike had dumped squarely on the main line approach to the copper kestrel spur. The spur is blocked," Finley yelled, waving his arms at the train's engineer. "They can't by this order. They must unload at the Harker siding." The train began to slow, its brakes hissing in protest, great clouds of steam billowing into the snow-filled air. It stopped, the engine idling, a great iron beast waiting for instructions. The railroad crew, the brakemen and the engineer, leaned out, their faces confused, looking at the platform of politicians and the crowd of angry ranchers. "What order?" the engineer shouted down, his voice a gravelly boom. "My manifest says, unload at the Pike Dugan yard." "This order," Judge Kincaid's voice cut through the wind, "this order from the Territorial Commission supersedes your manifest. You will proceed to the Harker priority siding, or you are in violation of railroad charter." The engineer looked at his brakeman. This was above their pay. Ephraim Pike, seeing the train, seeing the crew hesitate, saw his last chance. If his freight could be unloaded, even by force, he could claim possession. He could tie this up in court for years. "Dugan." Pike roared, his voice a raw scream of desperation. "Dugan, the switch! If they won't go, we'll make them." Horace Dugan, who had been slinking near the back of the platform, saw his own future evaporating. He burst from the shadows. He wasn't a fighter. He was a rat. And he was trapped. He sprinted, not for the crowd, but for the manual switch lever that controlled the track, the one that would divert the train from the main line onto the spur. "No!" Finley screamed. "The main line isn't clear. You'll derail them." Dugan didn't care. He grabbed the heavy iron throw lever. If he could just get the cars moving onto the spur, onto his marked land, the argument would change from paper to steel. "Silas!" Goldie yelled. Silas was already moving. He vaulted onto his mare in a single, fluid motion. The horse, sensing the panic, reared, but Silas brought her down, kicking her flanks, driving her straight at the switch. It was a race a desperate man on foot against 1,000 pounds of horseflesh. The train, its engineer confused, began to ease forward, the massive drive wheels chugging. Dugan put his entire wiry weight into the lever. It was heavy, stiff with ice, but it began to move. The points of the track, 30 yards ahead, began to shift. "Dugan, stop!" Silas roared, the mare closing the distance. Dugan gave one last, desperate heave. The lever slammed over with a heavy, metallic clank. The track was thrown. The train was now locked, aimed directly at the spur. Silas didn't slow. He rode the mare straight at the man, reining her hard at the last second. The horse's shoulders slammed into Dugan, sending him flying backward into a snowdrift. But it was too late. The train was already moving, the clack, clack, clack of its wheels accelerating, rolling past the switch and onto the siding. Silas was trapped. He was on the track, the engine bearing down on him, Dugan's body on one side, the switch lever on the other. The engineer was leaning out, frantically pulling his whistle, the shriek deafening. There was no time to turn the horse. Silas was boxed in. "The flag! Finley! The flag!" Goldie screamed, grabbing the station master. She remembered her father, drunk but precise, explaining the signals. The red flag. Finley, paralyzed with terror, just pointed. Goldie burst into the station house, grabbed the rolled-up red flannel flag from its bracket, and ran back out onto the platform. She didn't wave it. She didn't panic. She planted her feet, just as her father had taught her, in the middle of the track, facing the engineer. She held the flag out, stock still, in the Universal Railroad signal for an absolute, immediate, emergency stop, obstruction on the line. The engineer, who had been squinting, saw her. He didn't see a woman. He saw the signal. "Brakes!" he roared. "Yee! Brakes! Damn y'all!" The train screeched. Sparks flew from the wheels, bright orange against the gray snow. The sound of metal on metal was a physical pain. The heavy freight cars slammed into each other, the clanging echoing off the mountains. The engine, steam and smoke pouring from every vent, shuddered to a halt. Its heavy iron cow-catcher stopped not 5 feet from where Silas sat on his trembling mare. He hadn't moved. He had trusted her. The stable was dead silent. The only sound was the hissing steam and the howling wind. Goldie lowered the flag, her arm shaking so badly she almost dropped it. The engineer, his face white as the snow, climbed down. He stalked over, his fury palpable. "What in the blazes is this, you ma'am? You signal an emergency stop. You'd better have a body or a busted rail. You nearly killed us." Goldie didn't flinch. She walked, her legs trembling, and handed him the notarized order. He took it, his eyes scanning the first line. He saw the seal. He saw Judge Odessa Kincaid. His anger vanished, replaced by a wary understanding. He walked over to his brakeman, and they read it together. The brakeman looked at Pike's pile of timber blocking the track. He looked at Dugan, who was climbing out of the snowdrift. He looked at Goldie. "Well, hell," the engineer said. Folding the paper, he turned to Pike, who was still on his platform, his face a mask of disbelief. "This order is legal. We're to unload at the Harker Priority siding." He pointed to Pike's timber. "And this is on it. We can't move. We're blocked." The full weight of the situation settled on the crowd. The train was stopped, the track was blocked, and the clock, the demurrage clock, was running. Ephraim Pike finally found his voice. It was a high-pitched shriek. "I will not be stopped. I'll buy this whole town. I'll buy that judge. I'll have your jobs. I'll have all of you in prison. This is my town." The crowd, which had been silent, stirred. "Don't sound like your town, Pike," the blacksmith yelled, his voice a deep bass. "Sounds like her town." "Yeah," shouted another rancher. "You gonna buy the Territorial Commission? 2 your man brackets in his own jail." A wave of laughter, cold and sharp, rippled through the crowd. The fear was broken. Pike's power, built on intimidation and backroom deals, had evaporated in the public. Snowy light. He was just a small, red-faced man on a box, yelling. Horace Dugan, however, was not finished. He was ruined. His reputation with the railroad was destroyed. He had nothing left to lose. His face contorted with pure, animal rage. He surged from the snowdrift, but not at Goldie. He went for Silas, who was just swinging his leg over his mare to dismount. "You!" Dugan screamed. "You broke-down rancher, you ruined me!" In his hand, a blade appeared, a long, thin skinning knife. He lunged, aiming low, at Silas's gut. Silas wasn't expecting it. He was off balance, half on the horse, half off. He tried to turn, bringing his arm up. The blade flashed. Silas grunted, a sharp intake of breath. The knife point caught him, slicing through his thick canvas slicker, high on the shoulder. It was a shallow cut, not deep, but it was fast. Dugan raised the knife again, this time for a killing strike. "No!" Goldie screamed. But she wasn't just screaming. She was acting. In her hand was a coil of rope, a lasso she had grabbed from a peg on the stable wall as she ran out. It was her tool, the tool of her trade. She didn't throw it. There was no room. She snapped her wrist, a short, violent, underhand throw. The loop was small, but it was perfect. It shot out, uncoiling, and settled neatly over Dugan's head and right arm. Dugan froze, the rope dropping to his bicep. Goldie didn't wait. She hauled back with all her strength, planting her boots in the snow. The rope snapped taut. Dugan was yanked off his feet as if he'd been kicked by a mule, his arm pinned to his side. He landed flat on his back in the mud, the knife flying from his numb fingers. The crowd roared. Ira Beaumont stepped calmly out of the crowd. He picked up the knife, wiped it on his trousers, and folded it shut. He walked over to the prone, gasping Dugan. "Horace Dugan," Ira said, his voice mild, pulling a set of handcuffs from his coat pocket. "By order of Judge Kincaid, you're under arrest. Assault with a deadly weapon, attempted derailment of a federal transport, and, well, I'm sure she'll think of more." He clicked the cuffs shut. The sound was as final as a gavel. The tension broke. A wave of cheers, real and spontaneous, erupted from the crowd. The ranchers, the blacksmith, the townspeople, they were clapping. They were whistling. Silas slid off his horse. His hand pressed to his shoulder. Goldie ran to him. "You're hurt. It's a scratch," he said, but his face was pale. He looked, not at his shoulder, but at her, his eyes full of a raw, stunned admiration. "Your father, he didn't teach you that." "No," Goldie said, her hands shaking as she pulled his slicker open to see the wound. "The horses did." Suddenly, a new sound, a loud crack and the snap of heavy canvas. On top of the nearest freight car, the wind had caught the edge of a heavy, snow-laden tarp. It was flapping wildly, threatening to tear free and dump its load of what looked like finished furniture onto the tracks. "Hey!" the engineer yelled, looking up. "The tarp! We'll lose the load!" The brakeman started for the ladder, but he was a heavy man, and the car was tall. Before anyone could move, Goldie was running. She ran to the side of the car, grabbed the iron rungs, and began to climb, her skirts tangling around her legs. "Goldie, no!" Silas yelled. She didn't listen. She was a woman who knew rigging. She knew knots. This was her world, too. She scrambled onto the roof of the boxcar, the wind tearing at her, trying to pull her off. The world was a dizzying, swaying blur of white. She planted her feet. The train crew watched, their mouths open. She moved with purpose, grabbing the flailing canvas, her small weight against the wind's power. She found the broken rope end. Her fingers, though numb, found the fray. She didn't just tie it. She wove the rope back, bracing her knee, pulling it taut, and finishing it with a taut line hitch, a knot the railroad men recognized instantly, a knot that would hold. She secured the last corner, gave the rope a final, solid tug, and then, and only then, did she look down. The entire town was silent, watching her. The engineer, his arms crossed, just nodded. Once, a sign of ultimate professional respect. Goldie climbed down, her face smudged with soot, her hair torn free from its bun. Ira Beaumont was waiting for her, holding a clipboard and a pencil. He'd taken them from Mr. Finley's office. "I believe," Ira said. "This is yours to write." He was holding a blank demurrage bill. Goldie took the pencil. She looked at Judge Kincaid, who gave a single, crisp nod. She began to write, her hand steady now. She wrote the time. She wrote the train number. She wrote the name of the obstructing party, Ephraim Pike and Horace Dugan. And under reason for delay, she wrote obstruction of a legal and prior preference citing, materials unlawfully placed on Harker livery easement. She handed the board to the engineer. "By law," she said, "this must be paid before your train can be unloaded. Every hour you sit here, the fee doubles." The engineer grinned. He took the clipboard and walked over to Ephraim Pike, who was standing alone on his platform, his grand banner ripping in the wind. "Mr. Pike," the engineer said, enjoying himself. "A bill for you, from the Harker livery." Pike was trapped. He was caught in the teeth of his own machine, the demurrage fees ticking up, the town watching, his reputation destroyed, his partners in jail. Silas stood by his horse, his hand on his wounded shoulder, his coat flapping in the wind. He was watching Goldie. He was watching her stand tall, the red flag still in her hand, her chin up, facing down the railroad. He wasn't her savior. He was her partner. She had saved him as much as he had saved her. The applause started. It wasn't the thin, paid-for cheering of Pike's drifters. It was a roar. It started with the Blue Lantern ranchers, was picked up by the blacksmith, and then the whole town. It was a wave of sound, rolling from the station platform to the livery doors. Red Hollow had finally chosen its side. The hissing of the steam engine was the only sound left, a rhythmic, angry breath in the sudden, frozen silence. Horace Dugan was cuffed, his face pressed into the dirty snow. Ephraim Pike stood on his platform of lies, a living statue of ruin, the torn banner flapping around his head. The entire town, a jury of more than 50 souls, stood watching, waiting. Judge Odessa Kincaid did not wait for the snow to settle. She was a woman of the law, and the law had been broken in her presence. She walked, her boots crunching, to the center of the open space between the crowd and the platform. "This is not a celebration, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice cutting through the air. "It is an arraignment." She turned to Mr. Coulter, the tall rancher. "Place that platform's whiskey barrel in the center. That will be my bench. This station yard will serve as my courtroom." The barrel was rolled into place. Judge Kincaid stood behind it, her hands resting on the rough wood. She was the highest authority in the county, and her court was now in session. "We will take these matters in order," she announced, her voice ringing with an authority that dwarfed Pike's entire fortune. "First, the matter of the copper kestrel spur." She held up Goldie's validated, notarized application. "Let it be known to all present and to the Territorial Commission that I have reviewed the original contract of 1880 and the recovered ledger from Ghost Lantern Gulch. The prior claim is binding." She looked directly at Goldie. "The Harker livery. Goldie Harker, proprietor, is hereby confirmed as the sole and primary holder of the siding preference for the copper kestrel spur, for a term of 10 years, effective immediately." A murmur went through the crowd. It was official. Second, the matter of obstruction. She pointed to the train, stalled and hissing. She pointed to Pike's mountain of timber. "The railroad, in the legal execution of its duty, is blocked. The demurrage bill, as filed by Miss Harker and submitted to the train's engineer, is legal, binding, and accruing by the minute. It is the debt of the men who caused the obstruction. It is the debt of Ephraim Pike and Horace Dugan." Pike, his face the color of old ash, opened his mouth. A dry, rasping sound came out. He was a banker, a man of numbers. He was calculating, in real time, the cost of his own arrogance. The numbers were catastrophic. Third, the matter of damages. The judge's voice became steel. "Ira Beaumont." Ira stepped forward, holding his glass plate photographs. "Your Honor, I have here photographic proof of the boot prints left at the scene of the arson attempt at the Harker Livery, and a photograph of the deputy, Jed Slocum, wearing the identical boots." He held up the bar receipt, and a receipt, signed by Sheriff Brackett, paying for the celebratory drinks for his men, dated the night of the fire. "These crimes," the judge said, her voice low and furious. "Arson, conspiracy, destruction of property, these are not just debts. They are felonies. A lien for the full cost of these damages is hereby placed against the personal and professional assets of Ephraim Pike, pending a full criminal investigation." "No," Pike whispered. He stumbled back, grabbing the rail of his platform. My bank, your bank, Mr. Pike," the judge said, "cannot protect you. Your shares in the Red Hollow Bank and Trust are frozen, as of this moment, to cover these debts and damages." He was finished. The town watched as the man who had held all their notes, who had built his empire on their debts, was undone by his own. Fourth, a matter of the law itself. Judge Kincaid's gaze was terrible. She looked at the two ranchers who held the slumped, defeated figure of James Brackett. "Bring him here." They pushed Brackett forward until he stood before the whiskey barrel. His head hung low, his face blotchy and slick. James Brackett. The judge said, "You were entrusted with the safety of this town. You were given a badge, an office, and the public trust. You used that trust to threaten, to intimidate, to suppress evidence, and to commit felony arson, all in the service of one man's greed." She looked at Mr. Coulter. "Mr. Coulter, the badge." The rancher stepped forward. He was holding the small tin star. He did not hand it to the judge. He walked, his steps heavy, to the platform where Pike was frozen in his tableau of despair. He looked at Brackett, then at Pike. Then, with a gesture of profound contempt, he tossed the badge onto the wooden planks. It did not make a heroic sound. It landed with a single, small, dry clink. The sound of an empty tin can. "James Brackett," the judge declared, "you are stripped of your office. You are under arrest. You will be transported to the territorial prison to await trial." Brackett made a small, broken sound, and the ranchers led him away. No longer a sheriff, just a man in a wet coat. "Fifth," the judge said, turning to Ira, who held the cuffed Horace Dugan. "Mr. Dugan, for the crimes of assault with a deadly weapon upon the person of Silas Crowell, and the willful attempt to derail a federal transport, your contract with the Union Pacific is hereby nullified. You, too, will stand trial." The railroad engineer, who had been watching all this with a grim fascination, let out a breath. He stepped forward, cap in hand. "Your Honor," he said, "I mean begging your pardon, but my train is here. The railroad requires a local partner to unload freight. If Mr. Dugan is unavailable and Mr. Pike is also unavailable, my orders are to find a bonded agent. Who do I sign with?" The entire yard went silent. Judge Kincaid looked at the station master, Mr. Finley. Finley looked at the engineer. And the engineer, a practical man, looked at the only person in Red Hollow who held a legal, binding, 10-year contract for siding preference. He turned and walked directly to Goldie Harker. "Ma'am," he said, his voice respectful, "it seems the Union Pacific Railroad is in need of a new siding partner. Effective today." Goldie stood, the wind pulling at the strands of hair torn loose from her bun. She looked at Silas, who was leaning against his mare, his hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder, his eyes blazing with pride. He gave her a single, slow nod. This was it, the final move. The engineer, seeing her hesitation, fumbled in his heavy coat. "We need to sign the agreement. The rate it'll have to be what you set." He pulled out a block of official railroad forms. I'm sorry, ma'am. With all this, I only have a carpenter's pencil." A small, hard smile touched Goldie's lips. "That will be perfect." She took the pencil. It was thick, heavy, and octagonal, worn smooth by a working man's hand. It was not a banker's quill. It was not a lawyer's fountain pen. It was a tool. She didn't use the barrel. She turned to the solid wood wall of her own livery. She pressed the paper against it. The engineer pointed. "Just sign there, under siding proprietor." Goldie signed. Not Miss Harker, not a looping, delicate signature. She wrote, in clear, strong, block letters G, Harker, prop. She handed the pencil back. "One more thing." The engineer paused. "Ma'am?" Goldie turned, not to the judge, but to the town. She faced the blacksmith, the ranchers, the women who had come out to watch, the men who had stood with her. "This contract," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd, "will have a community clause." She looked back at the engineer. "Write this down. 5% of all fees collected by the Harker siding will be paid monthly to a new Red Hollow Town Fund." The crowd murmured, confused, but listening. "To be managed by a board of 3, she continued. "The blacksmith, the mercantile owner, and the rancher, Mr. Coulter. Its first purposes will be to establish a formal fire brigade and to create a fund for the widows and widowers of this county." A beat of stunned silence. This was not just victory. This was not just revenge. This was a new foundation. This was a woman who had been left with nothing, turning her victory into a shelter for everyone. The blacksmith, a man of few words, ripped his heavy cap from his head. He held it high. "Aye," he roared, his voice like a bellows. "Aye," shouted the Blue Lantern ranchers, their hats held high. "Aye." The voice came from the women, from the shopkeepers, from every corner of the yard. It was not a cheer. It was a vote. It was a thunderous, unanimous roll call that sealed the fate of the old Red Hollow and gave birth to the new one. Ephraim Pike watched from his platform. He looked around, searching for a single ally. There was no one. The drifters were gone. Brackett was gone. Dugan was gone. He was marooned on his island of failed ambition. He slowly, mechanically, sat down on a crate of his own useless lumber. His tall, silk hat, the one that had made him look a head taller than every other man in town, sank as he lowered his head into his hands. He was, at last, a small man. Ira Beaumont, his job done, lit a thin cigarillo. He nudged Silas, who was wincing as Goldie. Her face, a mask of concentration, began to inspect his wound. She built her own walls. "Crowl," Ira murmured, smoke trickling from his lips. "She won't be lonely anymore." "No," Silas said, his voice rough. He wasn't looking at his shoulder. He was looking at Goldie. "She won't." The checkmate was at hand. The engineer, his new contract signed, turned to the only matter left. He walked over to the defeated banker. "Mr. Pike," he said, his voice devoid of all sympathy. He held out the demurrage bill, the one Goldie had written. "The first hour's fee is now due. Your materials are obstructing this line. You must pay, or I will have my men clear this track, and the cost of that will be added to your account." Slowly, his movements stiff, Ephraim Pike reached into his waistcoat. He pulled out his personal bank book and a pen. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely write. He signed the draft. He tore it out. He handed the payment, the first of many, to the engineer. The engineer walked it over to Goldie. "Ma'am, the first payment for the Harker livery." Goldie looked at the paper. She saw Pike's broken signature. She saw the number. She did not smile. She simply folded the paper, a small, crisp gesture. It was done. She turned her back on the broken banker, her eyes finding Silas. In the midst of the crowd, they shared a look. It was not triumph. It was exhaustion. It was relief. It was the silent, profound acknowledgement of a war won, a fight survived. It was the look of two people who had, together, endured. The wind, as if its work was done, died down. The last of the snow squall passed, and a single, weak shaft of afternoon sun broke through the clouds. It lit the front of the Harker livery, catching the frost on the new pine. The stable door, which Silas had left ajar, swung open in a new, clean breeze. From inside, the wind carried the unmistakable, sweet scent of fresh hay. A new era had begun. The noise of the town, the cheering and the recriminations, faded with the light. Ephraim Pike had been escorted back to his own bank, a prisoner of his own ledger. Brackett was in his own jail cell, with a Blue Lantern rancher sitting outside, whittling and watching. Dugan and his deputy, Slocum, were both tied and awaiting the territorial marshal, who Judge Kincaid had wired for. The train, its engine breathing low, waited on the track. The demurrage clock ticking, the wind had died, leaving the cold, clean silence of a new world. Night settled over the Harker livery siding. It was no longer a half-built skeleton of one woman's spite. It was a fortress. It was a business. It was a home. Inside, the air was warm. The horses, hers, and Silas's stood quiet in their stalls, the sweet, dusty smell of hay rising around them. The small forge, which had been the centerpiece of the false fire inspection, was now lit, its embers glowing a deep, soft red, casting a warm light over the main aisle. Goldie was not celebrating. She was working. She moved through the stable, her hands checking the harnesses, testing the tension of the new braided rein, running her palm over the leather of a saddle. This was her center. This was the work. Silas was there, leaning against a post, his arm in a clean sling she had made from a torn flour sack. His face, in the low firelight, was stripped of all its weariness. He just watched her, his eyes quiet and deep. She came to the door of the tack room, Her tech room, her office. Her hand rested on the door handle, the one Silas had made. It was an old, cast-off horseshoe, a thing of no value, worn thin. He had heated it in the forge, hammered it, twisted it, and bolted it to the wood. It was scrap. It was ugly. It was impossibly strong. She traced the cold iron with her fingers. Trash, she thought. Trash can still hold weight, if it's hammered true. She turned. Silas was still watching. He hadn't moved. He was letting her come to him. She walked across the straw-strewn floor. She stopped directly in front of him. He was taller than her, a solid, immovable presence, smelling of pine and cold air, and the faint, clean scent of the lye soap she had used to clean his wound. She didn't say thank you. She had said that with the emergency flag, with the lasso, with the final, defiant signature. She raised her hand, the one that was not cut, and placed it on his chest. She could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart through the thick wool of his shirt. Then she rose on her toes and did what she had done in the storm. She pressed her lips to the hard, stubborn line of his jaw. In the rough stubble, it was not a question. It was a statement. She kissed the scar from an old fight. She kissed the place where his pulse beat, strong and slow. She moved, a chain of small, slow kisses, a silent map of gratitude. Silas's breath hitched. He let out a low groan, the sound of a man holding on by a thread. His good hand, his left hand, came up, not to her face, but to her hair, his fingers tangling in the strands that had come loose, burying his hand in the mass of it. Goldie, he whispered, the name a raw, broken thing. She didn't stop. She moved, her lips finding the corner of his mouth. It was all the invitation he needed. The restraint, the years of solitude, the wall of his own grief. It all broke. He turned his head, his mouth capturing hers. It was not like the kiss in the storm. That had been desperate, a frantic discovery. This was slow and deep and certain. It was a kiss of profound, bone-deep recognition. It was the end of a lifetime of being alone. She melted against him, her body, weary and aching, finding its natural home. Her hands left his chest and wrapped around him, her arms circling his strong back, her hands spreading flat, holding on. His arm, the one in the sling, was useless, but his other arm, his good arm, was all he needed. He held her head, his hand in her hair, his mouth claiming hers. And then his hand moved. It slid down her back, over the thick wool of her coat, down, down, to the small of her back. He settled his hand there, pressing her close, but it wasn't enough. His hand slid lower, over the curve of her hip. It found the heavy hem of her outer skirt. He didn't hesitate. His hand, calloused and sure, slid beneath the cold, heavy wool. She gasped against his mouth, her fingers clutching his shirt, but his hand did not seek skin. It moved through the layers, a map of her defenses, until his palm rested, warm and solid and possessive, on the practical muslin of her petticoat, covering the strong, solid curve of her hip. He was not taking, he was anchoring. With a low groan, he applied a gentle pressure, his hand pulling her forward, lifting her, fitting her body perfectly against his. It was a solid, undeniable heat that passed straight through the layers of fabric. It was not a violation, it was a vow. It was shelter, it was safe, and it made her tremble from head to toe. They stood there, locked together, lost in a kiss that erased the past. It erased the ice, the fire, the fear. His hand held her lower back, a solid brace, keeping her steady. Her hands clung to the back of his coat, a mirror of his own grip, a testament of loyalty. When they finally broke, they were both breathless. She rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed, her world reduced to this one. Solid man. Silas, she whispered, her voice thick. I'm here. This, she said, trying to find the words. This isn't a fairy tale. It's not a storybook from Boston. She pulled back, just enough to see his face in the ember light. This is just work. Isn't it hard? Shared work. He looked at her. His eyes, the color of sun-cured pine, dark and tender. He brought his hand to her face, his rough thumb brushing the soot from her cheek, the way he had done before. "I told you," he said, his voice a low, rough gravel. "I don't believe in destiny. I believe in facts. I believe in the work." He held her gaze, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, the one she had kissed. "I choose you, Goldie Harker. I choose you when you're driving posts. I choose you when you're fighting blizzards. I choose you when you're facing down murderers." His voice dropped, became thick with an emotion that shook her to the core. "I will choose you, every single day. That's the work, and that's the fact." He sealed it with another kiss, softer this time, a promise. From outside, beyond the solid walls they had built, the night was changing. One of the horses in the stall gave a low, contented whicker, a sound of peace. And from the town, from the Canary Coal, came a new sound. It was not the tinny, false brass of Pike's party. It was a single banjo, being plucked in a slow, sweet melody. It was a sound of relief. The town was breathing again. Red Hollow had changed its rhythm. Goldie finally stepped back, though he kept his hand on her arm, as if unwilling to let her go. "There's one more thing," she said. She walked into her tack room. He followed, watching. She lit the small lantern on her workbench. There, sitting where it had been for months, was a letter. It was addressed to a lawyer in Boston. It was the letter she had written when she first arrived, the one where she offered to sign away all her claims, her name, her very identity, just to be free of the Harker burden that Arthur, her fiancé, had thrown in her face. It was the last ghost. She picked it up. She was about to tear it in half. Silas's hand, his good hand, covered hers, stopping her. She looked up at him, confused. He gently took the letter from her. He looked at the Boston address. Then he put it back on the table. He placed his large, warm hand flat on top of it, a gesture of finality. Then he slid his hand over until it was covering hers, lacing his fingers through hers on the rough wooden bench. "No hurry," he said, his voice quiet. "We'll settle that, together." He squeezed her hand. "As long as it's real." He meant every word. He wasn't afraid of her past. He wasn't afraid of her father's debts or her broken engagements. He was just there. They stood in the quiet room. He did not ask for more. She did not offer it. The night, the victory, the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion, it was enough. He banked the fire in the forge. He unrolled his bedroll, not outside her door, but inside the main stable, where he could see her, and she could see him, a guardian, a partner. She went into her tack room and blew out the lantern. The stable was dark, but not completely. A sliver of cold, hard moonlight cut through the gap in the planks, the ones they had nailed up together. She lay on her cot, fully dressed, her boots still on. She heard the horses shifting in the hay. She heard the soft creak of the leather as Silas settled into his bedroll. She heard his breathing, and he heard hers. Their rhythm matched the slow, peaceful breathing of the horses, a harmony of souls finally at rest. The love between them was not a fragile thing. It was like the rain they had braided together. It was strong. It was practical. It was meant to hold. Outside, in the cold, clean moonlight. The new, hand-painted sign creaked on its hinges. Harker Livery Siding. It was not a plea. It was a statement. It was her declaration of independence. The next morning, the sun rose. The train, which had sat all night, was finally cleared for unloading. The checkmate was complete. Goldie Harker sat at her workbench, the Ghost Lantern Gulch ledger open in front of her. The train's engineer stood before her, his cap in his hand. "First manifest, ma'am," he said, handing her the paperwork. "It's the consignment from Mr. Pike." Goldie picked up the carpenter's pencil. She signed her name. G. Harker, Prop, authorizing the first ever shipment to her siding. She looked up, through the wide-open doors of her stable. She could see the yard. Ephraim Pike was standing there, his shoulders slumped, his silk hat in his hands. He was waiting in line, to pay his fees, to the woman he had tried to burn, to the woman he had tried to bury. And as she watched him approach, a small, slow, and absolutely final smile touched Goldie's lips. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Let's build a community right here. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more folks.